I'm in a crappy band with some old high school buddies. A few weeks ago, our bass player, Parker, informed the rest of the band that his parents had flown to Europe and left their house for us in Fort Collins. His dad is a sound engineer and has a recording studio in the house. We were pretty excited, so we packed light and made the drive from Cali to Fort Collins, ready to track a backlog of 8 songs we've been sitting on. It was mid-spring, and the mountains looked pretty beautiful, oceans of blue and yellow wildflowers. The drive was long, but it was nothing short of exciting. In fact, everything was so beautiful that one night after a recording session, Parker suggested we go camping. I laughed at the idea. They all knew I had somewhat a negative experience in the Rockies a few years ago, but Ronnie and Jeff jumped on board. Parker recommended some vanilla tent camping at the foot of the mountain, but Ronnie had a bright idea. He wanted to do some astrophotography, and for that, he said, we need to go to a place that's really dark. So he spent some time on Google and discovered Comanche Peak Wilderness, a remote section of a popular national park. What a great idea, I remember chirping. Surely nothing could go wrong, right? Of course shit did go wrong, and it started on the drive up there. People always forget that quote-unquote evening begins at around 3 p.m. in the deep woods. As soon as the sun starts to dip behind the treetops, the gloom sets in and things get eerie, but my body rejects it because my brain knows it's too early for dark. I was on edge the second that the paved road gave way to dirt. The other thing people forget is just how loud the woods are at times, and how silent they are at other times. The contrast between them can make your head spin. One moment, it's a symphony of owls and crickets and toads. Then a branch will snap, or thunder will crack, and suddenly, you're wondering if you've gone deaf. Then of course, if you think about it too much, you realize just how full of darkness is, with all those watchful eyes. We went in as deep as we could. We left Parker's truck on the side of some forgotten road and hiked about half a mile into the trees. There was no trail. We followed the GPS to a tiny lake that was somewhere uphill, where Ronnie could set up his cameras and get a clear view of the sky. We hadn't crossed a solitary soul after entering the preserve for a few hours prior, and I felt kind of nervous about the fact that no one knew where we were. By dusk, we had set up 2 tents that Parker had borrowed from his parents. We made a small bonfire pit between them and hanged all of our food up in the trees like you're supposed to. Ronnie set up his cameras along the shore, and then we waited for nightfall. My anxiety got worse as darkness ate away at the sky. The guys didn't notice. They drank and smoked and carried on. And of course, right when the world turned to black, the leaves began to crunch in the distance behind our tents. A girl emerged from the trees and stopped at the edge of our little clearing. This girl must have been 8 years old and was wearing a white dressing gown, like she had just woken up. She had platinum blonde, almost white hair, and skin so pale that she looked like a ghost in the firelight. She wasn't carrying a flashlight or anything. She had been walking in the pitch black forest. She squinted at our fire as if it was annoying her, and she let out a few wet coughs. We all just stared at each other in confusion as she studied us. There were no roads or trails in this area. This was not a campground, and her presence made no sense. Jeff eventually called out to her, asking if she was okay, and she replied, "My mom's sick. Can you guys come help us?" Where is she?" Jeff asked. The girl just pointed into the forest. The trees and shadows and mist clustered together to form a great big wall of nope. I gave Jeff a fuck no head shake. I might be a coward, but I'm not about to disappear by some evil wood ghost. Ronnie stood up and asked the girl if they were camping or if they had a house or what. The girl just said, "She's really sick. Just follow me." Then she started coughing again. At this point, all 4 of us could sense that something was wrong. Parker, the most clever of all of us, invited the girl to come warm up by the fire and explain what was going on. I think he knew she would decline. The girl just turned and walked back into the trees, coughing as she went. But before she vanished, she turned around and said something, but we couldn't be sure of what. I heard, "So, you'll be a liar." But Ronnie said that he heard something different. "Soon, you'll meet the liar." We built the fire up a lot more, mostly to keep a good perimeter against the darkness. All of us were creeped out, but after a few hours the guys had forgotten about the girl. They just laughed and told stories. At some point, Jeff and I went to the tree line to take a piss. I walked about 10 steps into the woods and blasted the dark with my flashlight, with Jeff following closely behind. I wanted to see if there was a clearing on the other side, or a footpath that the girl might have followed, but there was nothing, just impassable trees. That's when we heard Ronnie shouting something, so we jogged back to the fire and saw him examining the southern edge of the clearing. That was the direction we had left the truck in. Parker said as we passed by. He's saying that he thinks he heard more footsteps. I also heard them. Standing next to Ronnie, I could make out a new pair of feet trampling the leaves in the darkness. It was louder than the girl had been, most likely bigger. "Show yourself," Ronnie shouted. To my surprise, a woman answered him. She laughed and said, "Don't shoot. I'm just a hiker." We moved back and watched her step into the clearing. She was most likely in her late 30s and was wearing a raggedy hat and an old beat-up pack. I remember having Parker grumble something like, "Real private spot you found here, Ronnie." And I agreed. How the fuck were all these people bumping into us way out here? The woman introduced herself as Sarah and apologized for scaring us. Ronnie demanded to know what she was doing out here, and she explained that she had done the full day loop around the mountain, but got lost for a while. She claimed to have found her bearings and now knew where she was going. "You know the way back?" he repeated to her. "Yep, in the dark without a flashlight?" I know this area pretty well." But Ronnie wasn't buying a word of it. He turned back to the rest of us and said, "We're getting cased, you guys. We're about to get robbed. As soon as we fall asleep, campers get killed by thieves and crackheads all the time." "Well shit, thanks for bringing us out here, dumbass," Jeff said. Sarah laughed again. She was real smiley for a woman lost in the woods. In the dark, that is. "I swear it's nothing like that," she said. "Look, I'll be on my way." For whatever reason, I felt the urge to press further. So I said, "You know you're not the only person we met out here who's walking around without a light." That fake little smile fell off of Sarah's face, and it took the wind right out of my sails. She stared at me like she could see down into the deepest places inside of me. "You met the little girl?" she asked with a blank expression. Everybody else I exchanged looks. Sarah collected herself and a new smile spread across her face. She said, "Don't listen to anything that little brat says. She's a liar. Look, why don't you guys hike down to the ranger station with me? It'll be safer together." And she pointed into the woods behind her. Something lit up in my brain at that moment. This was the second time a stranger had tried to get us to go into the dark. We weren't going to get robbed. Something much worse was about to happen. Parker seemed to have come to the same conclusion, and he invited Sarah to instead join us around the fire. As he knew with the little girl, he knew that Sarah would decline. The strange woman then told us she had to get back before it got any colder, and with that, she turned and hurried into the trees. After a long debate about what to do, we decided that hiking back to the truck was the fastest way to get lost or killed. We hadn't used the trail, and our phone batteries were low. Every time the wind blew, it set 1,000 trees groaning and shivering, which made it impossible to know by sound. And it was so black that if I stared into the darkness long enough, I started having minor hallucinations as my brain tried to make sense of the void. So we kept the fire blazing and agreed to sleep in 2-person shifts. Since Parker and I were the most sober of the bunch, We agreed to stay up first, but only an hour into our watch, we started hearing the coughs and sputters of a little girl in the distance. I followed Parker to the lake's edge, which lay about 30 yards from our camp. There, we started hearing an eerie voice in the breeze, and I saw the silhouette of a person milling about near the water, about a few hundred feet away, and I realized it was the girl. She was wandering around in the dark. We booked it back to the fire and woke up Jeff and Ronnie, telling them about the girl's presence, but as we discussed what to do, another voice erupted from nearby and began singing as well. It sounded just like Sarah. Parker and I jumped into the tent with the other guys and sealed it up, terrified that the time had come for whatever these creeps had planned, but no one approached our camp. The two people just walked in slow half circles behind the trees, singing together in a language I couldn't identify. Ronnie always keeps a menacing looking trail knife on him whenever we go hiking, and he scrambled for it while shouting that he'll kill anybody who came near us. His yelling caused the people outside to go quiet for a few moments. I pulled out my phone to record some of the voices, but my hands were shaking so much I could barely operate it. I caught a bit of the girl, but then something even more weird happened. None of us are sure of how many people were in those woods, but we heard a third voice at that moment, and it was deeper and guttural, like the sound of some night creature stalking around in a jungle. I'm not sure the noise was made by a person. Ronnie and Jeff believe the sound is coming from the girl, who has a coughing fit, and then begins channeling some demonic voice. Parker and I think it's a third person or an animal that was with them, waiting for us to leave the safety of the bonfire. Here's a sample of the recording. Sorry for the poor quality. I have a crappy phone.
You know what you did. You know what that guy did.
After the commotion, the activity in the woods died down for a while. The guys and I remained inside the tent, terrified, only leaving it to throw more wood on the fire about once an hour. None of us slept, and for the rest of the night, we heard distant singing, laughing, coughing, and the occasional whisper. Sometimes the girl would say, "Can you help us?" in the exact same tone, as if her voice had been recorded and replayed over and over. We also heard someone, most likely Sarah, climbing a nearby tree and shouting things like, "I see you boys," and "Let's go together, it's safe now." And that was it. By dawn, we were exhausted from fear and half frozen in the tent. The noises stopped and the people, if there were people at all, had long abandoned their efforts to draw us into the dark. We packed up and hiked back to the truck, which had thankfully not been ransacked. As far as I'm concerned, the next time I go camping, it'll be in a treeless desert in Arizona. And I'll see if I can get Ronnie to post some of those night sky shots. Two years ago, I went to go visit family up in North Minnesota around Labor Day weekend. I won't give the exact location, but will provide at least a general location where this happened. To keep it short, I'm hoping someone may have had similar experience, or may have had a general idea what this thing or entity was walking around our tent. On that Labor Day weekend, my girlfriend and I were planning on spending time camping with her family. Both of us were very excited to get away from the everyday city life, and we anticipated a much needed low-key weekend. We arrived at their location around noon on Saturday. and were all greeted by everyone there. During the day and evening, we were enjoying ourselves with random fun activities and catching up on how everyone was doing. As the night started to settle in, we were all near the campfire for a few hours until 11 p.m. Eventually, the family and ourselves called it a night, and we all headed to bed. My girlfriend and I were offered to sleep in a bigger size 6-person tent. It belonged to a relative who I will call Mary. It was a kind gesture at that time, as we only brought a 2-person sized tent. Having that additional space for our belongings and our air mattress was a nice added feature. Mary's tent was positioned not too far from the campfire and the rest of the family. The family did a wonderful job clearing and maintaining the area for their smaller RVs and additional tents. To the back of the tent, about 20 to 30 yards, is where the woods started with semi-thick brush and trees. Us 3 were laying down chatting, and eventually they both fell asleep. For some reason though, I couldn't sleep, so I was on my phone passing time, hoping to eventually drift off to sleep. This is when I heard a faint noise in the woods about 40 yards back. I dismissed it right away, as deer are known in this area, and I continued to space off on my phone looking at random things. About 10 to 20 minutes later, I heard something get closer to our tent. I could hear twigs snapping and moving between bushes getting closer to our area. This started to get my attention, as I could start physically feeling a faint shake in the ground as this thing was wandering around. Moments later, this thing was about 10 yards away from our area, walking, running back and forth. Whatever this thing was, with each step it took, I could physically feel the vibration from the ground. This thing was big, and the best way to describe this feeling is if you went to a live rock concert and you felt the kick drum hit your body. At this point, I was a bit terrified, as I was trying to follow the footsteps, walking or running at the back and the side of the tent. This thing got at least 5 yards near our area, and then suddenly it stopped where Mary was sleeping at, near her tent. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, scared of what this thing was going to do next. I shit you not, a few seconds later, Mary shot up from being dead asleep. She gasped for air and was calling our names to wake us up. You could hear her voice. She was terrified. This thing hightailed off back into the woods. Both of us were very startled at this point. The woods had become dead silent, and eventually we got enough courage to look outside. We saw and heard nothing, and about 30 minutes later, we ran to the shop to grab a shotgun. Another anomaly during this whole thing, while we were alert and awake, Mary mentioned during this time I was awake that she was having a dream. She mentioned these things were tormenting her, saying they wanted her soul and to give it to them. My girlfriend dismissed the whole thing and said it was most likely just a deer, etc., running around. After hearing my girlfriend say that, I never told anyone about this story until recently, as I started to think about it again, trying to figure out what the hell this thing or entity was. I have never shared a story with anyone before, in the hopes that you all get a glimpse of what actually goes on in the res from someone who actually went and experienced something. But I'll cut to the chase. I got to be part of a Navajo ceremony not long ago. It was for a book that me and some friends were working on. In the end, it ended up being one of the most meaningful events of my life, and I feel very blessed to have been able to experience it. There's just one small problem. The people I work with aren't big believers in the sort of thing, and I don't really have friends outside of work, and I don't really have family. I mean, I do, but that's actually a long story. Basically, I have nobody to talk to about my experience, but maybe you'll be kind enough to listen while I ramble a bit. Or maybe you won't, and that's fine too. Either way, it's always useful to put pen to paper, so let me start from the beginning. It was spring, a couple of years ago. Me and some friends are working on a short textbook for students containing interviews with Native Americans from different tribes. I happen to be the natural pick for the Navajo, since I recently completed a brief assignment there. On that assignment, I became friends with a guy that I'm gonna call Bill. Bill is actually young, but he's actually pretty close with the tribal leadership. He'll be an asset to me on this new project, so I reach out to him one morning. I'm wondering if he can get me in touch with some interesting tribal members. His response surprises me. "Hey, it's funny you call. Someone actually wants to meet you." Well, that's a happy coincidence. Bill says that there's this medicine man. I'll call him Jordan. Jordan randomly approached Bill a few days ago. He told Bill he was holding a special ceremony and asked Bill to ask me to attend. For context, I never even met this medicine man. In fact, I barely even know Bill, other than as a contact. So naturally, I'm asking, why would you want me? And Bill has no clue. "Hey man, he just told me to reach out to you." So I ask when the ceremony is being held, and he responds, "A couple of weeks from now." That's a lot sooner than I thought. At first, I thought I might not be able to make it, but keep in mind, I'm an academic. Publish or perish is the motto. Not only that, but Navajo medicine men are known for being private. A first-hand look at a Navajo ceremony with a real medicine man. Now that's a good opportunity. It could be a real highlight of the book. Who knows? Maybe it'll open doors for me. I'm picturing lectures and paid speaking engagements. I'm exaggerating a bit, but you get the picture. I want to contribute something good. So I tell Bill, I'll be there. Just tell me where I need to be. So Bill actually gives some very complicated directions. I jot them down. A week later, I'm barreling through the Navajo Nation in my old Jeep. Following Bill's directions, I turn off the main highway. From there, it's a long drive through the middle of nowhere. It'll be a couple of hours before I get anywhere near where the ceremony is going to be held. The Jeep bounces along, kicking up dust the whole way. In the meantime, I'm trying to read these confusing directions based on the geographical landmarks. I'm reading them as I'm driving, but also keeping my eyes peeled. I'm looking for a hogan. And in case you didn't know, these things can blend into the desert real easy. I'll attach a picture so that you all can see. I don't want to miss it, but before I know it, daylight is beginning to disappear. Now I'm getting worried. This is actually taking more than a couple of hours. I'm starting to think maybe I took a wrong turn somewhere. I'm secretly cursing Bill and his awful directions. So the sun is beginning to set. I just about resigned myself to a night of sleeping in my Jeep when I see it off in the distance to my left. It's a hogan for sure. I make a beeline towards it by the last light of day. My Jeep rolls to a stop as the sun sinks below the horizon. The desert goes dark. I breathe a sigh of relief. Later on, I note that this is the first moment when I felt that something wasn't quite right. I'm relieved to find the hogan, of course, but in my stomach, I feel butterflies, and not the good kind. So I do something weird. I sit there. I don't get out. I don't even move. After all of the rush of getting my bags packed, emailing my department about the trip, getting some of my responsibilities covered by other people, and hauling gas through the middle of nowhere, I'm actually debating about going inside. Why am I hesitating? After some time, the academic side of me wins. Snap out of it, kiddo. You got some work to do. I chalk up my hesitation to excitement jitters. I step out of the Jeep and it finally hits me. I'm about to be a witness to a special Navajo ceremony. I find myself wondering the same thing I asked Bill when he first called me. Why was I even invited here? I pause in the darkness, staring at the little mound of a building that I'm about to enter. Before I do, a scene plays out in my mind. I enter the hogan, and an open fire burns in the center. Around in a crowd of silent Navajo men sit in their rustic clothing. The medicine man is in a traditional Navajo garb. The flickering light casts its shadows on their faces. Yeah, I don't know what I was thinking. But anyways, by now, I know better than to expect these cliches. In fact, there's no open fire, no silence. Instead, I find the men talking cheerfully, wearing everyday clothes. A few of them have on cowboy hats. They're swapping stories and don't even acknowledge me when I come in. I sit down by the entrance. The women are mixing cornmeal and water. Then they grab palm-sized scoops out of the mix and roll them into balls into the center of the hogan, where I expected the open fire. But instead, there's a small oven with a big stone griddle on the stovetop. The women slap the cornmeal balls flat onto the hot stone. They sizzle. The aroma is amazing. I'm reminded that I actually haven't ate in several hours. A woman offers me a bowl of steaming food, and then the grilled cornmeal cakes start coming off the griddle. One of the women hand me one, and I begin to stuff my face. As I begin to eat, one of the men says something. It must be funny because all the others start to laugh. And then there's this one older man who lets out this big, booming laugh. And just like that, I'm back with my grandparents. So let me give you some background on my grandparents. My grandpa was a big bear of a man, enormous hands, big snow white beard like Santa Claus. Grandma, on the other hand, was a small southern woman, very outdoors. She had a garden that I helped her tend. In the summer, it was packed with cucumbers and tomatoes, and all kinds of other veggies. That grandma would turn everything into soup. She actually baked cornbread too, and it's still one of my favorite meals. As the aroma filled the kitchen, Grandpa would steal me away. He would take me under the sycamore and tell me stories. In a way, my grandpa was a very old world guy who knew a lot about spooky folklore. Most of the stories he told me involved trolls and elves. He used to tell me the story that I remember so much. As a boy, Grandpa and his friends would spend hours in the woods back in his hometown, not in the US. One day, they found something in a clearing in the trees. This specific area of the woods was not unfamiliar to them, but none of them had ever seen this clearing before. It was like someone just came in overnight and cut down a circle of trees in the middle of the forest. Only the clearing was totally flat and grassy like nothing had ever grown there. And in the center stood these very big stones, taller than any of the boys. There were 6 stones total, covered in moss. Grandpa and his friends went up to touch them. They noticed that the stones had big ugly faces carved into them. They had noses, a mouth, eyes, and ears. One of the boys said that they are trolls. This idea scared them, and they all took off running for home, scared, but laughing. The next day they teased each other about being scared of the stones. They decided to go back, but they could never find a clearing again. They looked around for months without luck. Eventually, they just gave up. Grandpa would end the story by pointing to the woods surrounding the house, and he would say, "Those trolls are still out there somewhere." Then he tells me that the trolls always turn to stone in the light of the sun, but at night, the spell was lifted. The trolls would wake up in the moonlight, stretch their limbs, and shamble down the mountains. They moved quietly through the towns, and if you ran into one, best of luck. That troll had found its meal for the night. These stories spooked me pretty good when I was a kid. Grandpa knew this, so he would always finish by reassuring me, in the middle of the day, the trolls are asleep. There's no need to worry. Besides, I'm here to keep you safe. I always felt safer when he was around. He told me tons of other stories like this, always from his life back home, and most of them involved magic. And being a little curious kid, I wanted to know if magic was actually real. So one time I asked him. Keep in mind, my grandpa had a funny way of putting things. I can't remember the exact words that he used, but I do remember the essence of what he said. So I asked him, is magic real? And he says, magic actually works backwards. You have to believe in it before it becomes real. Obviously that confused me, so instead, I asked him if he believed in magic. You know how some people forget their dreams when they wake up, and then they claim that they don't dream. But they do. They just forgot. What the heck? Now I'm even more confused. So I would pester him about it all the time. Do you believe in magic, Grandpa? Yes or no? People who don't believe in magic are like sleepers who don't dream. It was always something like that. Nowadays, I find those responses kind of funny and kind of beautiful in a way, but at that time, I wasn't sure what the hell he was talking about. So the days would pass like this. Grandpa would tell me stories for hours. Then Grandma would come outside. She would bring iced tea bowls of soup, a plate piled high with cornbread. We would sit together under the sycamore and hold hands. Grandpa would say grace. Then we would eat right there on the ground. Grandma would pile extra pieces of cornbread onto my plate as I ate. She tells me all about how well the garden grew that year compared to other years. Grandpa would make jokes. His huge laugh would ring through the air. And this is how I spent the best days of me being a kid. They were my family. They were my home. My memories of those days are still vivid in my mind after all this time. But the year I turned 13, Grandma got sick. She was in the hospital for weeks before she passed. Grandpa took it hard. It almost seemed like her dying drove him a little crazy. He started forgetting things. His stories became less exciting, and they all ended very sad now. He would barely even laugh, and not long afterwards, he passed away too. So I went to live with my dad, and to be honest, he's not important. The only thing you need to know about him is that he wasn't really around for much of me being a kid. Even after I moved in with him, he was never home. The house was always empty. It was just me and the internet. And fuck, I miss my grandparents badly. I fucking miss the garden, and the stories, and the laughing. I didn't feel at home where I was. My dad wasn't much of a role model either, but I won't go into that. So I made a choice. I didn't want to live there anymore. I didn't want to end up like my dad. Somehow, I would move away and never come back. So I put my head down and focused on school. I got a job at 15 and began saving up my money. Eventually, I graduated. My grades were very high, and I made it into the university. My home life made me qualify for financial aid, as well as tons of other grants. It helped me get started on my road in academia. I used my savings to buy a Jeep that some old dude was selling on the cheap. And then when the next semester rolled around, I was going off to college. The house was empty as always. My dad wasn't there to see me off, and to be honest, I wasn't surprised. But still, it did hit me kinda hard. I was losing my second home now. My first home, my real one, I lost when my grandparents died. Now, I was turning my back on my dad and this empty house. The future was wide open, but I was scared. But I still hit the road. I didn't know where home was at, but I know it wasn't here. And, I'm sorry, I'm writing this in between a few things. I guess I'm getting sidetracked. But now that I think about it, this is the first time I really gotten a chance to think about these things. So I guess my mind is all over the place. But anyways, let me get back to it. So somehow, all of that led me to this place in the middle of the desert, inside a hogan, full of people I never met, eating their food and about to witness a ceremony that many outsiders never even get to see. People are laughing, and I'm shoving cornmeal cakes into my mouth. My butt is planted on the dusty floor. It's just like when I was a kid,
But then, something happens. Remember those butterflies I felt in my stomach when I first showed up? They're back. Except that now, they're pissed off. At first I'm like, fuck, I must be eating too fast. My stomach feels pinched. I slow my chewing, but I think it's too late. Before long, it feels like a dozen snakes are wrestling inside my guts as I try to keep it together. That's when I noticed him. A slim man, across the hogan from me. Without taking his eyes off of me, he slips a chunk of wood into the belly of the oven. He gives me a curious look, then he lowers his gaze and stares into the fire. Bill never described him to me, but somehow, I know this must be Jordan. He's actually very young, and he's wearing a beat-up ball cap. Not what you would expect from a medicine man at all. A woman takes my empty bowl of food. Jordan pulls out a small box and opens it. The hogan goes silent. Jordan pulls 2 small bundles from out of the box, one for protection and one for blessings. He later told me the following, but I'll tell you right now. It turns out that Jordan is here to help out a man named Leonard, and I'll call him Leo for short. Leo has been having terrible nightmares. They started just a couple of months ago, and these nightmares are always the same. Leo finds himself in some isolated area. He comes upon a campfire, and the flames burn black like charcoal. Leo says that the fire gives off an eerie glow. The sight of it always strikes fear into Leo. He wakes up from these nightmares covered in sweat. He says it's always the same. His dreams of the black fire, and then when he wakes up, there's a strange smell in the room. Pungent, but not unpleasant. Leo can't identify it. Sometimes he's up for an hour or so, unable to fall back asleep. During these times, the smell doesn't go away. Leo passes out, and when he wakes up in the morning, the pungent smell is gone. At this point, Leo's mother chimes in. She says that her son began to change when the dream started. He's always been a quiet, serious young man, but he's become paranoid and violent, and he's always angry. He's not the same person he used to be. It's like the dreams are changing him. She says that not long ago, she actually wanted to pay her son a visit. She walked as she normally does, and as she got closer, she could see from a distance that someone was outside of Leo's home. She said that this person seemed to be peering into the house through the front window. It was kind of late and somewhat dark outside. She said she couldn't tell who the stranger was, but she thought it was a friend that was going to check on her son. But then, as she got closer, and this is when she stopped talking, and I could see that there are tears in this old woman's eyes as she was trying to speak. And then she looked around and looked at me. There's a long silence, and then Leo says that he saw it from inside the house as well. But this is the weird thing, that none of them seem to want to say what it was. But at the same time, I'm looking around, and everybody in the hogan seems to understand. It's almost like they know what's being discussed, without anybody actually saying it. I look at Jordan for answers, but he doesn't speak. He just stares into the fire that burns in the oven. After a long silence, he does something unexpected. He begins to sing. It's out of nowhere, and I almost jumped in my seat. And as he sings, he pulls out this small pouch. He reaches in with his fingers and sprinkles some powder over the flames in the oven. I quickly know what it is. It's cedar. The aroma is pleasant, but I look over at Leo, and he reacts strangely. His body becomes tense. He seems dazed, with his jaw slack and his head tilting back. He almost looks like he's been knocked out cold, except that his lips are moving, which reminds me of my old roommate who used to mumble in his sleep. Jordan keeps singing, and the song is beautiful. Soon, despite Leo's weird trance, I'm pulled into Jordan's song. This next part is hard to describe. I'm not sure if maybe I went into a trance too, but as I was listening to Jordan singing, the sound of his voice seemed to quiet everything. I began to feel the music in my ears, then my chest. Then, it seemed to resonate throughout the wooden frame of the hogan itself. The only thing I can liken to it now is that feeling of being next to a speaker when it's blasting music. It wasn't exactly like that, but similar. At this point, it seems that Jordan's singing seemed to be literally all around me. It seemed to be coming out of the walls. I could almost see it like the hogan was moving itself. Like I said, it's hard to explain. It seemed to only last a few moments. I thought maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. Jordan's voice grew quiet, and then he pulled out a pipe and began to stuff it with tobacco. He took a few, and then with one last big puff, blew a huge cloud, and pulled out the smoke with his fingers, hanging himself all over with it. And then he took one last puff, and this time he blew the smoke all over Leo. And as he did this, Leo seemed to come out of his trance. His eyes were wild, like he had just woken up from a terrible dream. The pipe went around the room, and everyone followed Jordan's example. When the pipe came to me, I blew a cloud of smoke and patted myself all over with it, similar to the way that Jordan did. As I did this, I heard a knock at the small door of the hogan. Everybody went silent. Something was skittering around outside. I naturally thought this was an animal that was trying to get in, but there were more knocks, and they were coming from different sides of the hogan. Jordan then put his hand on Leo's head and started to pray. I then began to feel strange. For the record, I did dabble in drugs while in college, but never to a significant degree. My classmates all smoked pot. A few others took shrooms, but I never wanted to mess with that stuff because, to be honest, my dad was a fuck up and I was worried about becoming like him. With that said, during a deep period of depression, I smoked pot twice and I took shrooms once, but I never messed with alcohol. So I'm very familiar with the sensations, both positive and negative. I'm familiar with the off feeling of a bad trip, and to be honest, for a moment, I did wonder if Jordan just had to smoke something, but what I felt was not like that. It didn't feel like a high or a chemical sensation. It didn't feel like a bad trip either, even though I was beginning to feel scared. It was something else, something familiar, something I hadn't felt in a long time. At that point, the butterflies returned, and they hit me like a truck. My stomach was starting to jump all over the place. I once heard someone describe their food poisoning experience as their stomach feeling like a sack full of cats. That's what this felt like. I felt very ill. I tried to get a grip. I tried to tense up my stomach and get the sensation under control, but I could tell I was about to throw up. I was breaking out into a bad sweat, and nobody seemed to notice. Nobody, except Jordan. I found myself staring into his eyes. After the ceremony, Jordan would explain it all to me. However, the ceremonial smudge is different. How people react well to the tobacco, and that's a good thing. But when it doesn't sit well with people, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It means that the spirits are working on them in an uncomfortable but necessary way. The medicine man pays attention to these things. He watches carefully. Then he picks out the appropriate prayers based on what he sees. Jordan also tells me that on most occasions, everyone in the ceremony reacts the same way to the tobacco. Either the smudge goes well and everyone feels peaceful, or else the smudge makes everyone feel sick. It's one or the other. But what is strange is for the smoke to single out one person. If it was gonna be anybody, it should have been Leo. The ceremony was for him after all, and that's when Jordan began to suspect that he had been right to invite me. He explains all this to me later in private, but in that moment, I'm clueless. All I'm thinking is I'm gonna shit my pants, and I'm not exaggerating. I'm practically Betty dancing in my seat at this point. The others are starting to notice, and the knocking at the hogan has started to match the feeling in my stomach. It's gotten violent. Then Jordan lets out a piercing scream, and it all goes away. The sound of his voice settles my stomach. It's like it shoots through me, pulls out the board of snakes wrestling in my stomach. I have no other words for it. It's like someone unclogged the drain. I let out a huge sigh. I have sweat dripping down my face, my chest, and my back. The others are looking at me now. They must be wondering what the hell Jordan was thinking by inviting this non-native man into their bed. Leo is still in his own world, oblivious to me or the pounding on the walls. He's rocking back and forth. Jordan looks concerned. He passes something else around the room. It's a small bag or pouch. Each person pulls something out of it and then passes it to the next person. When it comes to me, I reach in and find that it's full of arrowheads. For the first time, someone speaks to me. The woman to my left leans over and whispers, "Don't let it touch the ground." I notice that she's eyeing me with concern. I must look like a mess. I pass the pouch to the next person, clutching my arrowhead. I'm not gonna let it touch the ground. Jordan is back to singing. His voice still seems to resonate in the walls. But to be honest, I don't know if I'm just being delirious. But there's definitely somebody or something outside. There are heavy footsteps moving around the hogan, and whatever it is, it's big. Jordan throws more cedar on the flames. Its aroma fills the space again. I inhale it. It feels good. I breathe in through my mouth to taste it. Weird, I know, but it made sense to me at that time. As I'm swallowing the cedar, I feel my throat begin to feel funny, kind of prickly. Then it closes up. It's a feeling I know very well. Jordan keeps adding cedar to the fire, and for the first time, I see some urgency in his movements. Now, he keeps glancing up as the knocking on the hogan moves from one side to the other. Another pouch goes around the room. Everyone else seems nervous. They're dipping their fingers into the pouch and streaking what looks like a white powder over their faces like war paint. Meanwhile, the tightness in my throat has given way to a rising lump. This is what the butterflies were warning me about. Jordan's voice is basically thundering at this point. He then holds up his arrowhead as the knocking on the walls grows louder. I can see that Leo's eyes are open, but nobody's home. Jordan then makes a gesture in the air with his arrowhead. Instantly, Leo lets out a huge sigh. He almost falls over like a deflated balloon. He wobbles for a bit. Then he looks around the room at us. His eyes are back to normal now. Meanwhile, the lump in my throat is about to burst. There's a sudden pounding on the hogan door. For the first time, I hear Jordan's voice start to crack. He glances over at me. I'm sitting in front of the entrance. The door is right behind me. I hear something that sounds like scraping or scratching. The wind outside is howling now. Maybe it's the strength of the wind, drowning everything out. But Jordan's voice is starting to sound weak. Then, something happens that sends the ceremony everywhere. There's another heavy pounding at the door. The wind picks up. There's a pop. And just like that, the door is thrown open by the wind. It slams open and shut in the blast. At that moment, the lump in my throat breaks, and tears flood my eyes. The women begin to scream. The men are shouting. The gust circles through the hogan. The fire starts to struggle, and Jordan's voice is barely even heard now, but his eyes continue fixed on me. He raises his voice and continues to sing, and the whole time I'm just crying. It's like years of sadness are pouring out of me. I'm crying like a baby, thinking about my dad, about the empty house with nobody in it but me. I think about my grandparents, and how they left me when they died. They were my home. In the midst of the chaos, the wind is tearing through the hogan. All of these different thoughts are raging inside of me. And then, just like that, everything is calm. The wind seems to literally sink into the ground. It's gone. I feel someone lay a hand on my shoulder. It's a large, heavy hand. I don't dare turn around. I'm afraid of what I'll see. I keep looking at Jordan, whose song is now ringing through the air again. It fills the space and resonates in the walls. I can feel it all around me. The tears are still running down my face. I feel something that I haven't felt in a very long time. I feel like I'm with my grandpa again. It comes from out of nowhere, but it feels completely real. I know he's gone, but I have this distinct feeling that he's right there. That it's his hand on my shoulder. All the anger I felt about him dying and leaving me behind, it all goes away. And all I can think about is how sorry I am. I feel bad for blaming him, and I actually want him to know that. Jordan is still singing, and I blink, and I look around, and everyone is looking in my direction. They're looking over my shoulder. There's a long moment when I'm just watching all of them. Then, they all bow their heads. Everyone except Jordan, who keeps his eyes fixed on something behind me. The hogan is resonating with his song again. The song is beautiful, and it feels warm in my ears. The feeling I mentioned, the one I haven't felt in a long time, it's a sense of connection. I feel connected with everyone there, even though I don't know anybody. I feel connected to my grandfather. I can feel his presence. He's in the room with me. I know it. I keep my eyes on Jordan, but I lift my hand up and reach back. I touch the hand resting on my shoulder. The hand is solid. It's real. And it's warm. Jordan throws a fistful of cedar into the fire, and I feel the hand grow warmer. Outside, it begins to rain. The flames of the fire are raging again, and Jordan's eyes are staring into mine. He's singing with a smile on his face. The hogan feels like it's breathing all around me, and for the first time that night, I speak out loud. I tell my grandpa that I love him, and Jordan's song is filling my ears again, and in the song, I can hear a voice that sounds like my grandpa's voice. By the time Jordan finishes his song, my grandfather's hand is growing cold. Then it fades, and the hogan is quiet for the first time since I arrived. The ceremony comes to an end sometime in the early morning hours. By the time that everyone leaves, the sun is rising. Despite the hell of a night I just had, I don't lose sight of my duties. I still need that interview for the book. Jordan is actually wide awake, so I interview him just outside the hogan. It's during this interview that he talks about the smudge and explains the purpose of the arrowheads in the face paint. But the question that was really burning in my mind was the one that had been there since I talked with Bill. Why was I invited? A non-native man and a total stranger. So Jordan told me when Leo's mother approached them about holding a special ceremony for her son, Jordan agreed to do the ceremony. He did what he always did. He prayed for guidance, and that night, he had a dream. In the dream, a creature was prowling around the hogan. Jordan was sitting inside, and a white man he had never met confronted the creature. When Jordan woke up, he wondered what this dream meant, so he prayed. Long story short, Jordan learned that the creature was the evil spirit that was afflicting Leo, and that it actually wasn't native. He said it was brought over by a non-native for some reason that he didn't make clear. Jordan knew that he needed to call upon non-native spirits to help him manage this thing, whatever it was, and without it, the ceremony would fail. From his prayers, Jordan understood that Bill was somehow connected to the white man from his dream. He also knew that I would be calling Bill, so he told Bill to invite me. When I showed up, Jordan thought that he had made a mistake. I wasn't the white man from his dream, but it was too late to do anything about it, and he carried out the ceremony as planned. When the evil spirit forced its way into the hogan, that violent wind that blew the door open, Jordan believed it was going to kill him, but then he saw that something was protecting me, though he couldn't see what it was at first, but he knew it was a spirit of some sort. Jordan then interrupted himself and asked if I knew what these ceremonies were called. I told him I wasn't sure, and he said, "We call these ceremonies sings, because the singing is crucial." He told me that songs are like food for the spirits. The same way that a good meal can comfort you or make you happy, the right song can give certain helpful spirits and make them stronger. Jordan felt the evil enter the hogan, trying to put out the fire, and if the fire had gone out, it would have been all over. But Jordan was focused on me and on my protector, and he sang a song to give it strength. He was at that point that he knew for sure that I was the person he had meant to invite, because as he sang, the spirit behind me took the shape of a man. It was the man from Jordan's dream. It was my grandpa. As soon as he appeared, the evil spirit fled. I asked Jordan why this was, and he shrugged. That was for the great spirit to know. But in his own experience, only good spirits that have intimate knowledge of bad spirits can chase them away. Maybe your grandfather encountered the spirit while he was alive, Jordan suggested. Then Jordan pointed out something else. The Great Spirit had used him to heal not just one person that night. First it was Leo, and then me. He told me that he noticed I had reacted badly to the smudge. That only happened because there was a deep cut inside of me that had never healed. My grandpa's spirit was there. When I smudged myself, I had allowed my grandpa to begin healing the wound. Later, after the evil spirit had fled, Jordan had stepped in and finished what my grandpa started. He closed all the wounds. I will forever be grateful to Jordan. There's more to the story, but I think I said everything I needed to say. I lost my family and my home when I was a kid. In a way, I lost myself after that. I grew bitter. I stopped dreaming, and I lost my faith. So I know I said this in the beginning that I wanted to make a few things clear about what goes on in the res, but I also wanted to share this story for those who have lost their faith. Anyways, I want to extend my love and gratitude to everyone that is listening to my story. I'll always be grateful for that.
My friend and I were at a party on the Hopi reservation in Polaca. It was getting late, and we had a pretty good buzz on. Most of the people we knew had already trickled out, so we decided it was a good time as any to leave. We looked around for the friend who was supposed to give us a ride, because we had all come together. We found him in a back bedroom, drunk and passed out, so we had no choice. We're gonna have to walk. The two of us lived on the other side of the gulch. A good 2 miles. Between were nothing but trees, scrubs, bushes, and some hills. We had barely cleared the houses onto the road passing between the wooded area when we got this funny feeling we were being watched. We decided to leave the road and cut through the trees. It wasn't the easiest walk, but it would cut the distance down some. And even though it was pitch black outside, we knew the way pretty well. We had been a good 20 minutes off the road and heading up towards the hills when that same feeling of being watched came upon us again. We both turned around at the same time, but it was so dark we couldn't see anything. But then, my friend Paul swore he heard some kind of cackling or mumbling. I didn't hear anything, except for maybe the wind in the top of the trees at our back. By that time, none of us was gonna admit it. We were feeling a little scared. Without saying a single word, we picked up the pace, moving along pretty good but not running. And that's when I heard it too. But now, it was more like heavy breathing. Paul then grabbed my arm and gave me a tug forward. We took off running straight up the hill, which wasn't that big, but it was still enough of a slope so I wasn't feeling it in my legs. And on top of that, I was drunk. Think about this for a second. Running up a hill, at night, drunk, complete darkness, and as you're running, you hear footsteps behind you, and heavy breathing.
Whatever it was, though, stayed with us every step of the way. Right at the top, Paul and I stopped and turned around, expecting the thing to be right on us. But we were standing there, huffing and puffing, and looking at nothing but darkness. A few seconds passed, and then we heard a thin laughter, as if it was coming from down the hill and back from where we started running. We decided to keep moving and put some distance between us. We turned to go down the other side of the hill, and there, standing right in front of us, was this creature. It was standing up on two legs, like a circus dog, only much taller, with both paws extended out in front of it. It had this coyote face, and it was grinning at us, all of its teeth exposed, and its tongue sliding from one side to the other. I couldn't believe how skinny it was, as if it hadn't eaten in weeks. Its rounded stomach sticking out like one of those African kids in the charity ads, and the skin sinking between its ribs. The smell was unbelievably bad, like the smell of an old, wet dog. We both jumped back with a scream, like two little schoolgirls. As we did, the creature dropped down on all fours and ran past us and down the hill back where we had come from. It was yipping and laughing all the way. Paul and I started praying like never before, swearing to Jesus that if he got us home safe, we would never drink again. The laughing, or whatever you want to call it, died down and disappeared. Wasting no time, the two of us made our way down that hill and into the trees that separated us from where we lived. As we walked along, we were trying to convince each other everything was okay. It was only a coyote out searching for a meal. We scared it jumped up at us, and then it ran away. We started feeling better about things overall. We got across the open field and into the trees. We made it all the way through there without anything else happening. However, just as we stepped out towards that first backyard that we needed to cut through to get to the street, we heard this unmistakable chatter, like some little monkey laughing, coming out of the trees just behind us. It was followed by the sound of something moving through the branches and twigs. My friend Paul then yelled out some words that he said that his grandmother had taught him, and just like that, the noise ceased and it got real quiet. He then grabbed my arm again and we ran. We ran as fast as we could through that yard and out to the road. We ran straight for the house where Paul lives with his grandmother. When we got there, we found her awake and sitting in the kitchen with only a small candle for light. She was burning some cedar. When she saw us, she put her finger up to her lips and then pointed to the outside of the house. Her lips were moving, but silently. We stood there still for a minute or two, and then she spoke out loud, saying it was okay. She then said a prayer, and that the skinwalker was now gone. I have no idea how she knew, and I didn't care. Needless to say, I spent the rest of the night there, sleeping where I knew I would be safe.
In the 1980s, when I was around 7 or 8 years old, my dad's father died. He lost a long-fought battle against cancer. I hate to say it like this, but I remember my family feeling relieved. The stress and pain my grandfather suffered was finally over. Now, my grandfather had been a man who saved his money, but never came around to spending it. And as my grandmother had long since passed, my father received everything from his father's will. My family received over $60,000 in the will, and after some time planning with my mother, my dad decided to put it towards his dream house. He wanted to return to the country lifestyle he grew up in. He thought the fields and woods would be a better place to raise my older brother and me. Soon, My parents bought a beautiful ranch-style home with 80 acres of land, much of which still had to be financed, but what they did receive from the will did cover most of it. I remember when I first walked through the doorway of the new home, it smelled like it was well-kept wood, the smell of freshly cut grass coming from the front door. My mother left it up to my brother and me to decide between ourselves which room belonged to each of us. This would be the first time having a room to myself. I was so excited that I didn't even care which room my brother picked. I do now wish, though, that I would have cared. I ended up with the room furthest away from my parents' room. This room was sizable, with 2 windows overlooking the fields outside. It also had a big closet that I had no idea what to do with. Lots of space for a boy who kept his clothes in a dresser. It was on the very first day there when strange occurrences began. Having told our parents which rooms we decided on, we started to unpack separately in our rooms. I was sitting in the back corner of the closet of my bedroom, figuring out how to stack my collection of board games, which were the only things I could think of to place in there at the time. I left my closet door open, as well as my bedroom door, so that the lights from the house and from outside would shine into the closet. The closet did have its own light source, one of those light bulbs with a pull string, but I had trouble reaching it, so I didn't even want to bother with it. I remember having just set down my Monopoly box when the closet door slammed shut. Instantly, I shot up and turned around. Without any light from the outside, the closet was pitch black. I called out my brother's name, assuming he was joking with me, but there was no reply. I ran towards the door, using the crack of light at the bottom as my guide. Then I looked around for the doorknob. I was relieved when I found it until I tried to turn it. It wouldn't move. It didn't make sense. The closet door didn't have a lock on the inside, or even on the outside of it. Why wouldn't it turn? As a scared kid, I could only assume my older brother was on the other side holding the doorknob still. We liked to joke with each other as all brothers do, but he had never been one to prank me like this. He was as much scared of the dark as I was. Moments after realizing that trying to open the door was pointless, I turned back towards the center of the closet. I reached my hand upwards, looking for the string to the light, or rather the feeling for it. It was difficult for me to reach out, but I knew if I could just feel the tip, I could jump up and pull it down, and the darkness would disappear. The longer I stepped blindly through the dark, the faster my heart was pounding. Being engulfed in darkness was a nightmare come true. Little did I know things would get worse. I did finally feel the small end of the string. Before I could jump up and try to pull the cord down, I felt something that took my breath away. An icy, cold hand from behind me. It placed itself on my neck and slowly ran up my cheek. I jumped and screamed so loud some of the blood vessels in my face busted. I practically tackled the wall next to me to get around the thing that had touched me. Quickly, I got towards the door and began to pound against it, screaming for anyone that might hear me. Moments later, my dad pulled the door open from the other side. I nearly fell on my face. I crawled out and quickly looked back into the closet. The darkness now cowered away from the light that flowed back through the open door. My dad picked me up and embraced me and looked at my face. Buddy, did you lock yourself in there? Jeez, look at your face. He wiped tears away from my red cheeks as he carried me to his and my mom's room to comfort me. I couldn't bring myself to tell him that the door didn't have a lock, but I was able to tell both of them what happened in there. But they blamed it on my intense fear of the dark. Specifically, my mom said, "Being that scared can make you see or feel things that aren't there, honey." She compared it to seeing figures or faces in the dark, when what you're actually looking at is a coat rack or a chair. As much as I love my parents, I didn't agree with what they said. The hand that I had felt was real, and I remember it clearly. Even now, that hand was not my own.
nor was it my imagination. Later on, when Dad went to my closet one night to grab one of the board games, I watched him do a double take when he opened the door. It was the first time he had actually taken a look at it. My dad looked at the doorknob over on both sides and raised an eyebrow. "Hey, buddy," he said as he checked out the closet door. "If you go in here, make sure you don't close the door or you might get stuck in there again. There's no lock, so it's most likely just warped or something." I nodded and did my best to believe him. Over the next few months, small but weird and creepy things would happen, especially in that part of the house towards my room. Dirty clothes that I would lay on the bedroom floor would often end up in the closet floor the next morning. When I began closing the closet door every night, out of fear of the darn thing, it would always be open in the morning. One day, when I was out playing after I had cleaned my room, my mom called me back inside, absolutely furious. When I went back inside to my room where my mom was, she was upset because of how trashy my bedroom was. She thought I hadn't cleaned it, but the state it was suddenly in was worse than I had ever seen it before. Every drawer in my dresser had been pulled out and dumped out. My blanket and sheet from my bedroom had been pulled off and tossed over the closet door, which was now open. Inside the closet were hundreds of board game pieces, as someone had dumped each of the boxes out onto the floor. I was shocked, but no matter what I said to my mom, she wasn't having it. She demanded that I clean my room before I was allowed to come out of the room. Obviously, I was upset, but I did as she said. I cleaned as fast as I could, folded all my clothes again, remade my bed, then stood at the opening to my closet. I couldn't bring myself to walk in there alone, especially after something or someone had just ruined my room. And I knew it wasn't my brother because we had both been outside. Why would my parents mess up my room? Deep down, I knew it was the thing in the closet. I stayed in that room 2 hours longer than I had to, unwilling to enter that closet to pick up the board game pieces. But when my stomach began to growl and the smell of homemade fried chicken filled the air, I forced myself up and into the closet. It took me a few tries, but I was able to jump up and catch the string to the light, so at least I would have some light if I did get stuck in there again. Quickly, I started to pick up the pieces on the floor. It was a pain matching them up with the right boxes, as about a dozen different games had been mixed up. Every few seconds, I glanced at the closet door, making sure it stayed open. I thought nothing could happen if the light was on. I was wrong. I picked up the final piece, eventually, a small white ball that I'm pretty sure belonged in the Hungry Hungry Hippo's box. I threw it in, closed up the box, and turned around. I stopped. A woman stood in the doorway. Her feminine shape made me first think it was my mother, but she was taller than her. Her hair was a mess and went down to her ribs. She stood facing away from me in a stained but light blue dress. She appeared to be looking out the windows of my bedroom. My voice failed me. I wanted to speak to her, but I had no idea what to say. I wanted to think it was some long-lost relative coming for a visit that I had never met before, and that I didn't know she was coming. Denial is a powerful thing. The woman was breathing in and out so slowly that I didn't even hear her breathing until long after I studied her. Her breathing was extremely slow and troubled, as if she had been a smoker for multiple lifetimes. Then, she lifted a bony finger and pointed towards one of the windows. I swear, she spoke. I think she said, "Such a nice day." Out of nowhere, in the blink of an eye, my vision was obstructed. I flinched away, first thinking that I had suddenly gone blind. But as I brought my hands up towards my face, I found greasy, messy hair
covering my small form. Then that slow, struggling breathing came from behind me. This woman was no longer in the doorway. She was standing right behind me, with her hair draped over me. I screamed, and then I ran. I ran where I last saw the open closet door. And Jesus, this sounds crazy, but the few feet I ran to escape that closet, each inch of the way, I was going through that hair. Her breathing stayed in the same spot in the closet, but the hair seemed infinite, as if it was no longer coming from her head, and instead hanging from the ceiling. Only when I bursted out of the closet did the hair finally come to an end. I turned to shut the door and found once again the closet empty. These are a couple of my most terrifying experiences with what I would eventually refer to as the Witch of Donner Farm. Donner was the name of one of the previous owners of the land. I wish I could tell you that I figured out who she was, that we ended up moving, and that it all stopped, but we didn't move, and it never did stop. It would happen randomly, and things might calm down for months at a time, but she was always there, seemingly preferring my side of the house. The experiences only stopped after I moved out at the age of 20. If you want to hear more of these experiences, let me know. I'm sure most of you won't believe me. I'm a 21-year-old Navajo. I have family that lives on a plot of land south of Gallup. It's about a 30-minute drive to my family's land, and it's surprisingly not deep in the woods. I remember first being in close proximity with a witch when I was about 7. I was at my uncle's house. Our land has 3 homes on it. His, my mom's, and his girlfriend. They were drinking, and my uncle went to relieve himself out the front door. I remember he freaked out and said there was a skinwalker outside. I freaked out, and his girlfriend said it was okay, that it was just Scooby-Doo, attempting to lessen my fear. Since it's been so long, I remember those important details only after that. I have no memory of what happened. That uncle passed away that year, and I always think about what could have been between me and him, now that I feel so alone, and the rest of my family isn't amazing as he was with me. Anyways, to be clear, I have never seen a witch, but these details are unfortunately true. Jumping ahead a couple of years, I'm in 8th grade. My grandpa, who lived with my mom and me, is in the hospital. I ended up sleeping in his bedroom because I always slept on my mom's floor due to being creeped out by the thought of a witch trying to peer inside my window or hearing the noises it could make. I wanted to sleep in there because he had cable in his room. His room is on the opposite end of the trailer where my mom slept. It's about 5 a.m. and I wake up to the most terrifying language I ever heard. It sounded like a cross between a hyena and a pig. The constant chit-chat between whatever was outside my grandpa's window haunted me in that instance. I listened for a couple of seconds, but I covered my ears as hard as I could out of fear. It was the most scared I ever been. After the whole ordeal, I went to my mom's room and crawled into her bed, telling her what happened and shaking a bit. I had school that morning, so when we went to start the car, I noticed in the area where I heard the noise, there was a trailer hitch, and sitting in it was a stray dog. My grandma then hired a medicine man after that happened, and he said that dog was in cahoots with the witches. I tried to get rid of him, but that dog always came back. It was skinny. I always had a bad vibe from that dog, which doesn't happen as I love dogs. After that encounter, I was truly scared of being alone. A year later, during my freshman year of high school, my mom died. Whether or not those jealous witches were the cause of her death, I'll ponder once here and there. She died from a bad cold, mucus in her lungs. I was asleep in her bedroom, but not on her bed. I went to bed around 10 p.m., and in the morning, she was very weak and cold, like she was hallucinating and didn't get under the blankets to keep warm. When I woke up, she was dead and sitting in front of her bed. That day changed my life completely, as I have never stayed at that house ever since she died. I stay with my dad now in town. My other grandpa said our family may be an active target of those evil witches. He said once in the 90s, when my uncles and their friends were at my grandma's land, they saw a fire and a witch doing a dance ritual on top of a mesa. They began to shoot at it. It sees them, and they take off when their girlfriends freak out. They leave, and the witch follows them from wherever they are. Keep in mind, this area has a lot of trees and isn't flat, like most of the Navajo Nation. My grandpa said that the witch followed my uncles back to where my family's land is. My family and the evil history of the area they settle at is real. I wouldn't type all this if it wasn't true. I don't like fake paranormal stories, and you wouldn't either if the paranormal was just a footstep away. After all the harm these witches have done, no one wants to talk about it or do anything about them. What is there to do? It's been 6 years now since my mom died. We saw what happened when my family interfered with this ritual and what ended up happening to all of them. So there are things out there that are just best left alone. I live in the downtown area of a major Texas city. To get away from the city and enjoy the outdoors and some alone time, I would make the hour-and-a-half drive almost every weekend to a small cabin that's in the woods owned by my family. I've been hanging out at that cabin in those woods almost my entire life, so I feel pretty comfortable there. The area doesn't have many people living there, and it's always safe. So one weekend, I took some of my friends out there to fish and spend some time away from the city. While fishing on the bank of the river that runs near my folks' cabin, we pulled up some chairs, started a fire, drank a few beers, and watched the sun go down behind the trees. That is life. After sitting around for a few hours, I suggested we go hunting the next morning for breakfast. The guys weren't big fans of waking up early to crawl around in the woods looking for something to eat. They would have rather stayed up all night drinking and fishing and wake up late the next day. "Let's just go hunting right now," said one of them. Everyone else agreed and started getting loud. I stayed put in my chair and replied, "Hell no, it's too late, it's too dark. We wouldn't be able to see a thing out there, man. Plus, there's those dang witches." Everyone knew I made a good point, but then one of them said, "Wait, what do you mean by witches? What are witches anyway? Like, seriously?" I laughed a bit because they all seemed so intrigued, and all of a sudden so focused. So I began telling the story of the last time I went camping and hunting in the woods around my parents' cabin. It was just like any other camping hunting trip I had gone out on. I packed a backpack with all the necessities, a .22 long rifle, an M&P, and a .45 that I would always carry. I parked my truck at my parents' place and walked down the dirt road until it disappeared into the woods. I make a point not to overhunt in any one area, so I hiked in a direction I knew I had never hunted in. After a few hours of hiking, I found a clearing in the woods that allowed some moonlight once it got dark. I don't use a tent when I camp alone, so setting up my camp was fairly easy. I got a fire going and quickly went to go find some small game for dinner before it got too dark. After bagging a few squirrels and a rabbit, I started to head back to my campsite. The night had already started to settle in, so it was getting quite dark on me. I took a moment to light up my lantern that was hanging off my backpack. I poured some lantern oil on it and got it going. A few hundred yards later, I heard a movement in the distance. Obviously, while moving through the woods with a backpack with a rifle strapped to it, you make a lot of noise yourself. However, the noises that came from deeper in the trees have a distinct sound, almost like an echo. So when I heard movement coming from somewhere else other than myself, I froze, staying completely still and listening. There was nothing. My brain started reasoning as fast as it could, and concluded that a branch might have fallen, or a deer might have gotten spooked and hightailed it out of the area. That was good enough for me, so I continued on through the dark in the direction I knew my campsite was in. The compasses don't lie, and I had learned how to use them and rely on them by this point in my life. I heard it, again. Noises coming from my right, north of where I was, and this time, I almost thought I heard a yell of some kind. Again, I froze, thinking it was coyotes. I'm not too worried about them, so I continued. The way back was starting to feel really long though, but hiking through the woods during the day is very different than hiking through the woods at night. Most of the time you hike slower, watching your steps more carefully, so it's not unusual that a hike the same distance could take longer at night than during the day. Before I go on, I feel like I should say that I was recently married at the time. Most likely less than a year at that point. Like I wrote before, I travel a lot throughout my life, and homesickness was not something I was familiar with until I met my wife. I'll call her Juliet. We met when we were both 18, and up until then, I had never missed my home or anyone whenever I was away. But once we started dating, I began to finally experience the feeling of being homesick whenever I was away for too long, and in some cases, not even long at all. That Friday evening, towards the woods I had left, I got home from work and sat down with Juliet for dinner before leaving. It had only been a few hours since I last saw Juliet, and yet I missed her so badly out here in these woods. So much so that I think I almost felt pain. Having said that, I think it's gonna make what happened next a little more creepy. Anyways, so I heard something. I froze and stood still in the dark woods and turned to my right. I was deeply confused because I knew what I just heard. It was Juliet calling me. Even though it sounded like she was a bit far, there was no doubt it was her. What the fuck is she doing out here? There's gotta be some sort of emergency. I gotta find her. She's most likely been calling my phone, and it's not even on. Something bad must have happened, I thought, as my mind raced to rationalize and come up with a realistic conclusion. Chip, Chip, she yelled through the trees in the distance. My name isn't Chip, but it's the secret nickname that she has for me. I basically jogged through the dark forest, towards where I last heard her calling me, stopping every now and then to listen for her again. Eventually I had to stop because I had not heard Juliet call out to me for a while. I stood there quietly, panicking for what must have been like 5 minutes, but every second was torturous. I felt like I failed to find my wife, to help her. She came all the way out here to find me because she needed me, and I couldn't even find my fucking way to her. And then, that's when I heard it again. Chip, Chip. Her voice quietly resonated through the tall trees, and she sounded like she was in pain. I began to walk as quietly as I could towards her, so I could hear her if she called out to me again. And she did. She sounded very much closer, and I was relieved as I felt myself getting closer and closer to her. Chip, Chip. This time, I was alarmed. I felt like I was about to be in danger, but I shook it off and continued towards my wife. Chip. Again. I kept listening to her calling me, but she didn't sound quite right. It almost sounded like it wasn't her at all. Just like two different people can say the same things in the same pitch and tone, but they can never sound exactly like each other. It was like there was someone else pretending to be my wife. and it was mimicking her voice, but I could hear her so clearly just a few moments ago. I figured she was choking up, trying not to cry, so I kept moving, again and again. I heard my wife calling out to me as I kept getting closer and closer. Each time she called though, her voice sounded less and less like her. By the time she sounded like she was only 10 or so yards away, I was on high alert. It sounded nothing like her by then. Whoever it was calling me wanted me to believe she was my wife, and by then, I knew for sure it wasn't her. I approached carefully with my handgun drawn. This person wasn't moving one bit, but I could tell where she was. I started getting closer, inch by inch, holding my lantern up in front of me, trying to see who I was dealing with. Then, peeking from around a tree, I saw two eyes reflecting the flame from my lamp. I have to admit, at that moment, I was fucking terrified. My wife is shorter than I am, and I was eye to eye with whoever this was, and her eyes were too far apart to have been Juliet's eyes. "Hey, is everything alright?" I asked her, like an idiot. "I can give you anything you want." I knew right away what she really was. I knew her malicious intentions. "Jesus, help me," I said under my breath in a fearful whisper. With my gun still in my hand, I safely aimed towards the ground with my finger off the trigger. As soon as those words left my mouth, she visibly flinched as if she had smelled something disgusting. I could tell by her silhouette and the reflections in her eyes though. I stood still, realizing what I had just said, while she backed away from me back into the darkness. Up until this point during my story, my buddy sat staring at me, completely silent, listening to me speak. "Dude, why the fuck didn't you just shoot her? You had a gun, didn't you?" said the youngest guy. I told him it would have been useless to shoot the witch out there. It wouldn't have killed her, or done any harm to her. "How? Why?" he replied. I began to explain to them what witches really are. People who practice witchcraft and offer rituals to demons they conjure in return for something they want. My theory was that this witch achieved her position through the sacrifice of people and animals. I could tell they were thinking it over and trying to decide whether to believe me or not. And to those listening, I know y'all might think this is crazy and not believable, and if I hadn't seen it at all before, I myself wouldn't even believe it. But the truth is, my parents were and still are very prominent figures in the church I grew up in. Being elders of the church community, they often perform exorcisms when I was a kid. And no, I don't mean the stereotypical Hollywood Catholic priest with a little white thing on his neck under a black jacket, holding up a wooden cross. They belong to a Hispanic Protestant denomination that in fact disagreed with and opposed Catholicism. Being too young to stay home alone, I was often taken with my parents on house calls to pull demons out of people. It was a horrible experience every single time. In Latino America culture, it's not uncommon for people and their kids to visit witch doctors, or even doctors who heal when somebody is feeling sick, or when they want their lives to move in a better direction, and sometimes when they want harm to come upon someone who has wronged them. However, being part of these rituals is like an open invitation for demons and leaves people open to demonic activity. So there was always someone in need of help in our community. I watched and listened to everything my parents did during exorcisms, and I had read every book my dad kept in his office about the subject. By the time I had this incident in the woods, I already knew what to do and what not to do very well. I continued my story after explaining a bit more to my buddies. As I was saying, I stood in the dark forest with my lamp held up, with my arms stretched out until I could no longer see or hear the witch backing away. My adrenaline took a while to finally settle down. Then, that's when the fear came. I tried walking back to my campsite quietly, but my nerves got the best of me, and I ended up almost running through the darkness. I was pretty confident I could find my way back, but either way, I kept checking my compass. After running and running in the correct direction, I never reached my campsite. I felt confused and doubted myself like never before. Maybe I really don't know anything about being out in the woods. How could I have gotten myself so lost? I turned around and walked until I saw a familiar pattern in the trees. Once I felt confident about where I was, I forced myself to walk back to where I ran into that witch. When I found the tree she was initially hiding behind, I stared at it for a good while, expecting her to peek around it again, but nothing. Thankfully, I retraced my steps back to where I had gone off the path to follow Juliet's voice. After hiking a bit longer, I found my campsite. I was exhausted, covered in sweat, scratched up, and hungry. I considered packing everything up and starting on the long walk back to the cabin, but I had no energy, so I called it a night. I didn't even sleep much even though I felt entirely drained. The woods were very loud that night, even by a summer night standard. The bugs and animals didn't stop to take a breath for a second, and the owls were very aggressive as well. I could hear them screaming near and far all night. Every time I began to drift off to rest, I would get awakened to the screams of the owls, echoing in the forest. Or at least that's what I assumed to be. I turned to look at the guys and asked them if they were still down to creep into the woods. They looked at each other and said, "Yes." "Well, y'all go ahead. I'm not going in there right now," I said, laughing to myself. "But it didn't even do anything to you. You scared her away," one of them replied. "Maybe, but it's only because I said the name of Jesus," I said. "Well, just say it again if she comes back, dude," he said, almost annoyed. "It's not that simple. I think you really have to believe for that to work. And I can say I really did believe back then. But now, I won't be calling on anyone to come help me." After I said that, I don't remember much about the night, other than that all of us ended the night by watching Blood Diamond in the cabin. It's the only movie that my parents have in there. I think it was already there when they bought the place. As for what I said about believing, I'm not 100% sure it's right. Most demons hate God and Jesus, and I'm not sure if they care if you believe in God or not. It's not that I don't believe in God anymore. However, the only reason I do believe is because I've seen the other side of things. That witch that I saw knew what I loved and what I missed, and that I would have done anything for my wife. I have seen, encountered, and even felt evil, but I have never felt God. La Llorona, a story from my grandmother that has been passed down to warn others that if you decide to visit Mexico, you may just encounter something terrifying and paranormal. Well, let me explain first that I'm not talking about visiting Mexico like the resorts in Cancun. I'm talking about the deep villages in Mexico and the ranchos, which is where the story takes place. My grandmother lived in a small village in Mexico with just a handful of streetlights and friendly neighbors. Everyone knew everybody, and my grandmother had 6 siblings, 5 brothers, and a sister. She recalled that her brothers used to hang around with the other neighbor boys, running around, playing games and causing trouble. There wasn't a whole lot else to do in a small port village. One day, while her brothers were out, my grandmother, her sister, and her mother stayed home, doing some chores and preparing dinner. As the sun went down and her children got back late, her mother decided to scold them as any mother would. But when the boys returned, they were visibly terrified. They had been running and slamming themselves into the small wooden doorway of their mother's house. My grandmother's older brother finally spoke up, crying and clinging to her mother's apron. He said, "La Llorona nos anda persiguiendo. Nos está diciendo que la sigamos. The crying woman is following us. She's telling us to follow her. She's still behind us." At first, my grandmother thought they were making it up to avoid punishment. But when she looked in the direction they came from, she heard something and saw a shadow passing back and forth under the lone streetlight. A loud, desperate cry filled the night. Her mother surprisingly began laughing and told the boys to go eat. She waved her hands and said, "You are not welcome here. Go find someone else who will actually listen." The shadow continued to sway, and for a brief moment, my grandmother saw a long-haired figure. Then, as quickly as La Llorona had appeared, she swayed again and disappeared. Her mother laughed and scolded the boys, emphasizing the importance of listening to their parents. My grandmother always considered her mom to be a brave woman who believed in all these things and warned them not to provoke it. She often shared these stories as both entertainment and moral lessons. The scars that her uncles bore served as a warning. Be careful at night and be weary of the cries if you're ever staying in Mexico. I'm a child of two Mexicans who were both born in Oaxaca, Mexico. For those of you familiar with the state of Oaxaca, y'all know how beautiful and rich in culture it is. And for those of you who haven't heard of Oaxaca, you need to visit at some point in your life. Not right now, because it wouldn't be responsible to travel with COVID being at its highest with its different variants. Anyways, I grew up visiting Oaxaca every summer because that is where my parents' families are, and they wanted my siblings and I to have a connection with our family there. Well, going every year and spending time there, a lot of scary, unexplainable stories were told to us. Some of them happened to my dad's family, or my mom and her family. I was always fascinated with these stories because I've always been a fan of all scary things. I love me some horror, so I would always ask my parents to tell me stories whenever our entire family was together, especially when we would have a bonfire. With that being told, I can now talk about one of the stories that my dad has told me that has happened in his pueblo, or village. I will not say what pueblo it is, because it does not matter, and I would not want to expose my dad's village like that. So here we go. In this pueblo, there are tales of people, mostly men, who turn into some type of werewolf animal on specific nights. I know what you're thinking, because it's the same thought I had. Werewolves. Like from Harry Potter, or from Twilight. But I'm not talking about those. Those are fictional. The creatures that I am talking about are creatures that look like werewolves, but they're different, and these are called naguales. They turn during a full moon, and only during specific seasons in the year. They turn at night, and turn back into their human forms in the morning. They know when they're gonna turn, and are aware of what they are doing, and what they should not be doing. So there was a man in this pueblo that had a farm where his chickens kept turning up dead in the mornings, and he had no idea what or who had killed them. He was furious because his chickens were his form of business, and since it kept happening, he decided to have a stakeout and have a rifle ready to shoot the animal that was attacking his livestock. When nighttime came around, he was hiding near where his chickens were kept, and when he saw the werewolf-looking animal, he shot it, and it left running and crying. When daytime came around, the farmer assembled a search party to look for the creature that he had shot the night before. They looked everywhere in the woods, and they didn't find the corpse of an animal, and instead follow a trail that randomly stopped. However, there was a man that had to go to the hospital the night before because he had been shot, and when the doctors asked what happened, he didn't give a single explanation to have been shot. The entire pueblo heard one single gunshot that night, but no animal was found. Yet there was a man with a single gunshot wound that appeared and could not explain who had shot him. Was it a coincidence? I will let you all decide that.
My wife, a native Navajo, invited me to go with her to her grandmother's house for Christmas. This being the first time I ever been to the Navajo res, I wasn't sure what to expect. I have ideas about what it might be like. Nevertheless, I was excited to go somewhere I'd never been before. Most of my excitement came from wanting to learn more about the other culture and the unique opportunity of visiting a res as an outsider. Because of this, I was also a bit nervous. What if I wasn't accepted? Would the people be welcoming, or would they feel a certain way about my presence? So we left our house on Christmas Eve with our dog, and we started to make the 4-hour journey to Grandma's house. On the way there, we saw a beautiful sunset scatter across the mountains. After traveling for about 3 hours, we found ourselves at the point that leads to an hour-long drive on an isolated road that would eventually take us to our destination. While we were on this road, my wife shared stories of dances and the practices that her tribe has. All of it fascinated me, and it actually left me asking more questions than I had imagined asking. By the time we arrived at Grandma's house, it was dark and cold outside. As I began to unpack the car, my wife took our dog a bit away from the house so it could go use the bathroom. By the time she got back, I had taken our bags inside and locked the car up for the night. As we sat around the kitchen table eating food that was cooked by Grandma, we shared stories and played a card game. After about an hour, we all said goodnight to one another and got ready to go to bed. At around midnight, my wife and I laid down, and I called out to the dog to go to bed. A short time thereafter, we fell asleep. I forgot to turn off the light next to the bed on the nightstand. And around 2 or 3 a.m., I woke up having to use the bathroom. That's when I noticed that our dog was just sitting, looking at the door that led out to the small hallway. On the other side was the main door to the house. I called for her to come back to bed, and she just put her nose at the base of the bedroom door, sniffing while scratching. So I assumed that she also had to go outside. I walked up to the main house door and opened it, ushering her to go outside. She ended up just sitting there and staring. After trying to get her to go outside a few times, and her not wanting to go, I closed the door and made my way to the kitchen to grab a glass of water. In the kitchen, there is a big window to the right of the sink that overlooks the driveway to the house, with a bit of light that makes the driveway barely visible at night. As I put my hand to turn on the faucet, my head turned to the right to look outside. And that's when I saw it. A dog, sitting outside and staring into the house. But there was something strange about this dog. It was much bigger than a typical large breed, by 2 times. I began to get the chills and internally said to myself, fuck this. Grabbing my water and about to head back to bed, that's when I saw that the dog stood up and began to walk away. One thing that I feel I might not convey well enough is the way this dog walked. It seemed to walk very awkward and almost stiff-like. I mean, what the fuck? What kind of dog even walks like that? First of all, dogs don't even really walk. After making my way to bed, I couldn't help it, but I was just thinking about that dog. As I laid in bed in silence, I began to hear faint, weird noises
coming from the darkness beyond the bedroom window. I eventually fell asleep and woke up the next morning. As I sat in the kitchen table, eating the breakfast that Grandma had gotten ready for us, I couldn't shake off the feeling of that strange encounter with the dog. Trying not to sound too alarmed, I simply asked if the neighbors had a large dog. But this question itself seemed to trigger a series of reactions from both Grandma and my wife. She gave a worried look to my wife, and they both exchanged glances, and without wasting much time, Grandma quickly stepped out of the kitchen and grabbed the old phone and began making phone calls to people that I assumed were members of their community. There was urgency in her voice, and I could sense that something was going on. I didn't even say anything else no more, and they didn't say anything about it either. Soon after breakfast, a native priest and a medicine man arrived at the house. They also entered with some urgency and quickly began talking with Grandma in whispering tones. My wife then joined my grandma in the conversation, and they all began to look at me and talk more. Then, the priest went around the house with sage, and the medicine man comes to talk with me and Grandma about my experience. I can see the priest draped in traditional clothing, retrieving more bundles of sage from a pouch, and also going outside around the house itself. To sum it up, I had encountered something. It was a presence, and me, being an outsider, had somehow drawn its attention. My wife then said that she would be back, and she eventually returned with a bundle of raw meat. It seemed that this raw meat was an offering, part of a ceremony to ward off this thing that I had encountered. At that moment, there was a ceremony held. I won't go too much into details because it's simply too much, but basically I encountered something that I shouldn't have the previous night. Nothing else happened after that. But now, whenever we visit Grandma's house, I have learned to abide by the unspoken rules that have been shared with me over the years. And so I'm telling you all this story so you all can be careful if you ever go to the res. Abide by these rules even if you're not in the res. I refrain from getting up to go to the bathroom at night. And if by chance any of us happen to witness something strange, that we should quickly speak up, not letting it linger in silence. And most of all, don't talk about these experiences with other people, as you never know who is listening. The town I grew up in was a nice place to live. We had everything any normal town had. Fast food joints, the movies, supermarkets, and we even had 2 different shopping malls. You might think that 2 malls would be a bit too much for a small town, and you would be correct. The reason our town had 2 was that the original one was getting ready to close, while the new one had just been constructed. Everyone I talked to, all my friends and family, myself included, all loved them, while we didn't enjoy the huge amounts of people who would gather inside the shops. The mall would bring out a sense of wonder in all of us. The new mall had just been built earlier this year. It was massive. It had department stores that seemed to go on forever. The food court had almost 30 different restaurants. It even came complete with the movies and ice skating rink. Though the place was very cool, it was often bombarded by people from the neighboring towns and cities, congesting it beyond capacity. Taking a walk through that mall was like trying to walk in the ocean underwater with ankle weights. It got to the point where I would prefer going to the smaller, older mall, which happened to be closer to my house. The older mall was constructed in the early 90s. It also had the movies, but it was a fraction of the size of the larger one. Actually, at this point in the mall's life, the only reason to go to this mall was the small arcade and to the movies. It often amused me to think that the large building was just that, a building for an arcade with a few game cabinets and the movies with only 8 rooms or so. Malls are great, but you'll never catch me inside one after the sun goes down. It was a midwinter's day when a couple of my friends asked me if I wanted to hang out. Me, being the outgoing kind of guy that I am, I agreed. After meeting up with the 3 of them, they asked me if we wanted to hang out for a bit, then catch a movie at the old mall. I nodded, and we spent all day chilling, since school had been out for a winter vacation. At around 5 p.m., we all made our way to the mall. The walking sucked, but since all of our parents worked, and we didn't have cars of our own yet, it was really our only option. As we walked and our feet went through the slurry of mud and ice, we joked and threw snowballs at one another the entire way there. We didn't arrive at the mall until 6:30 p.m., which wasn't an issue, since our movie didn't start until 10 p.m. Walking inside the mall was like stepping inside of a rotting animal. Darkened shops littered the marble walkways. Only a few of them had their lights on, but it seemed like no one was around to maintain them. The further we walked, I noticed that they had built a sort of drywall type barrier to close off sections of the mall. Even though the sun was still out and it was setting fast, the closed sections of the mall were as black as night. The arcade itself wasn't impressive by any means, but it was nice to have something to do while we waited for our movie to start. All of us spent some time at the front row of cabinets and located games to play. I was finishing up a rather lengthy game when my friend tapped me on the shoulder, informing me about the movie. I looked down at my watch and was stunned to see that 3 hours had passed. Time truly does fly when you're mindlessly staring at a video game. So we made our way up the escalators towards the top level of the mall, where the movie theater was, and purchased our tickets. The movie was just some B-rated PG-13 horror flick, but one of our group was adamant about seeing it. When we entered the room, I wasn't surprised by how empty it was. Not only was it 10 p.m. at night, but the mall itself was pretty empty anyways. The only people we had seen while we were there was a guy behind the popcorn stand, and some guy who sat in the back of the arcade, staring at a computer screen. The movie ended up lasting around 2 hours, and we weren't exiting the cinema until a little past midnight. I'm not sure why, but stepping from the theater room into the lobby was surreal. It was like I was in a place that I shouldn't be. The lobby lights were dim, and the concession stand was completely dark. One of my friends joked about going behind the counter and swiping some candy for the road, but I guess he felt guilty and he just continued walking along with us. Standing at the top of the escalators, we had a view of the entire mall. The previously illuminated shops were all dark now, and that once pitch black closed off area seemed almost like an endless void. At this point, the only sound we heard as we stood there was the clattering of the escalators as it cycled slowly. Once we were on the ground floor, we took a moment to scan around us, noting how we were most likely the only souls in the entire mall, as another one of our group suggested we go take a look around. At first, I didn't want to get in trouble, but I was eventually convinced into going along with words like, they'll just tell us to leave, and we can just say we got lost if they find us. We walked over towards one of the sections of drywall that was put up to separate the remaining shops from the closed down area. With a slight bit of effort, we managed to slide a section out of the way for us to step through. Stepping onto the other side of the wall was a strange feeling. Earlier when I felt like I shouldn't be there, this felt even more like danger to me, as if I went from standing on a cliff to walking on a tightrope. We began our walk through the abandoned part of the mall, 2 of my friends using their phones as flashlights. The only sounds we could hear were the clattering of the escalators growing ever distant, and our numerous footfalls as we pushed our way further into the darkness. We took note of the shops that had been completely gutted. Shelves and debris were scattered in and out of the shop fronts. Dismembered mannequin parts were all over the floor, both inside of the stores and outside. One of my friends picked up a mannequin hand and high-fived it before sending it flying further into the dark ahead of us. The sound it made echoed across the walls before quietly fading away. We all laughed to one another before a new sound forced us to stop. It sounded like the cracking of gravel or glass being stepped on. It was such a unique and distinct sound that we all froze in place, listening for a moment. Suddenly, a clatter sounded at my feet, and we all yelped. For a second, my friend directed his phone's light towards the sound, and I stared in shock. It was the mannequin hand that he had just thrown out. Only the wrist of the hand looked cracked and warped, as if something had squeezed it before throwing it. My friend shined his light on me, but I was too busy staring at something else. It was my other friend's phone, sitting on the ground with a light shining directly upwards. I walked over to it and gently picked it up. When I did, I flashed it around me. The light danced on the dark before I saw something that almost made me vomit. It was my friend, but he was standing as stiff as a board. He wasn't facing me, but instead was looking up at something. I shifted the light slightly, and I saw something impossible. Whatever it was, it towered above my friend, easily over 6 feet tall. Its face was twisted. I couldn't really make out its features, but with the number of teeth I saw, I didn't really want to. Its torso was short, but its limbs were like a spider's. Its legs were long and narrow. Its arms were dangling at its side. It didn't seem to be wearing any clothes, but instead had gray skin, with patches of black all over its body. I could feel my own body begin to seize when I saw the creature raise up a hand and rested it upon my friend's shoulders in front of him. He didn't even move as the creature touched him. He just stood there, silently. Just then, another one of my friends grabbed me by my shoulder, and I spun around in panic, almost knocking him down and dropping the phone. He told me we needed to leave right now. As I scrambled to pick the phone back up, when I turned, I flashed the light back on the spot from before, but my friend and the creature had vanished. In a panic, we all ran out of there as fast as we could. The entire trek home, we talked about what we had seen and what we thought happened to our friend. One of my friends said that he had only seen him standing there. The other one said that he could only see me in the dark holding the flashlight. And then I told him what I had seen, and if they had not been there, they most likely wouldn't have believed me. We all debated on what we should do, if we should tell our parents, or just pretend like it never happened. They were both in favor of acting like it never happened, but I couldn't just let one of my friends get hurt and not do anything about it. So about an hour after we got home, I made my way over to my friend's house, the one who was left behind. I knocked on his door, and his mom answered. I told her that I really needed to tell her something important, but just before I could find any word, I saw him, my friend, sitting at their dinner table, staring at the ground. I then asked if I could talk to him, but she said that he had only gotten home a few minutes ago, and that he wasn't feeling very well. I returned his phone while I was standing there, and then I went home. I haven't talked to or even seen my friend over the next 2 weeks when suddenly I was passing by and there was a for sale sign in their front yard and also a sold sticker plastered across the sign itself. I'm not sure what happened with my friend or why his family moved. I'm not sure who or what that creature was, but I don't think I will ever go to a mall after dark again. And I would advise you all to do the same. Going on a hike can be very therapeutic, and it's also a great exercise. At least that's what my ex-girlfriend said when she first took me hiking. It started out as just some way for us to stay in shape and spend some time together. The first time we went, I was a skeptic. I'm no stranger to exercise, but climbing up a mountain wasn't something I would consider relaxing.
I remember wheezing and struggling the entire trek up the mountain. I wanted nothing more than to just go home and just lay on the couch with a bag of chips. Once we had reached the summit, I'll tell you, there are only a very few sites that can match it. During our relationship, she and I would go hiking about twice a month. We always went to the same exact spot and hiked up the same exact trail. After a few months had passed, I was no longer wheezing and was able to truly appreciate the beauty of it. I actually never really knew how incredible nature actually was. After some time, our relationship started to go downhill. We had grown apart, and it seemed like every time we speak to one another, it would end up in a screaming match. Eventually, it became one fight too many, and we ended up breaking up. I'll be honest, it was rough for me those first couple of weeks. The realization didn't fully hit me until I was stepping out of my car and onto that dirt trail. It had become such a habit that I didn't even realize I was alone. Since I had already made the drive up to the mountain, I figured that I might as well go. The first hike, doing it alone, was heartbreaking. But surprisingly, she was right. It did end up being quite therapeutic for me. Making it all the way to the top on my own, I felt empowered and decided that I wanted to continue hiking regardless. So for the last 2 years, I gone hiking twice a month, on the same trail, on the same mountain. I did, however, change the days that I would go, just in case she still continued to hike up there as well. I didn't want to deal with the awkwardness of seeing her on the trail. However, yesterday was the last time I'll ever go hiking in my life. The day started out as any other. I woke up, got ready, grabbed my pack, and drove up to the mountain. It had been raining all week prior, so I made sure to bring along a sturdy pair of boots, just in case, you know. When I arrived, I stared at the swinging sign on a metal chain. It read, "Rock slide. The trail is closed." I huffed and got back into my car. I thought about going home, and in hindsight, I should have done just that. But instead, I was adamant about maintaining my routine. I drove around to the other side of the mountain, which didn't take me very long. It wasn't that big of a mountain. I found a spot that appeared to be a clearing of some kind. It looked like an area for hikers to disembark and make their way up the mountain. As I pulled up, I saw a dirt trail leading through the trees, even though it was much more overgrown than the other path. I looked around and saw that this one had no sign, so I figured that the rock slide happened on the other side of the mountain. I grinned, inhaled deeply, and began my hike. This path was much more difficult than the other. It took me nearly twice as long to make it halfway up than it did on the other path. I ducked under branches, pushed between trees, and climbed over boulders. I was beginning to wonder if this was actually worth it when suddenly, I stepped out into a clearing. It seemed like a little pocket of nature safely preserved by the towering trees around it. There was a small stream lined with flowers running through it, with some deer scampering off in the distance. I felt some renewed energy pour into me as I continued onward. After 2 more hours of walking, I finally broke through the foliage and arrived at the top. As I stood up there, catching my air for a few moments, I looked around and enjoyed the view. I had never been on this side of the mountain before, so I wondered if I could see anything different. It didn't take me very long to notice a small cabin about halfway down the mountain, not too far from where I hiked actually. I wonder who could be living isolated up here on the mountain. As I stared at it from high above, I thought I saw something move in the trees near it. I stared a few moments longer to see if I could see it again, but there was no more movement. Then, a group of birds flew out from the surrounding trees, and I thought that must have been what I had seen earlier, just a bird. However, my curiosity wasn't fully satisfied, so I decided that upon my descent, I would try to pass by that cabin,
Getting to it was much more difficult than heading back down the way I came. It was almost like the trees were blocking my attempts to get any closer. After nearly an hour of pushing my way through the brush that was in the way, I stepped out into where the cabin rested. The very first thing I noticed about it was that it appeared to be abandoned. The windows seemed to have been shattered long ago. The wood was slowly rotting away in places. The wooden front door seemed to sway and knock off the door frame, almost like a wind chime. This was obviously some hunter's cabin from long ago that had been neglected for many years. The sun was nearly behind the mountain as I stepped onto the wooden steps. My heavy boots making the wood below my feet creak painfully despite its age. I admired the carefully carved wood as I walked up to the door. I reached down and gently pulled the door open. It only let out a soft squeak of the hinge before opening fully. I peered inside, and even though it was starting to become dark outside, I could still see the interior clearly. The door opened up into a living area with racks and shelves and a small couch. I walked inside, taking care not to step on any rotting wood. To my left was the door that seemed to open to a small washroom and kitchen area, with just a passing glance that appeared to be empty. I walked down the short hallway, and there were two doors, both on my left and right. I opened the one on my right first. It was a bedroom. The bed had long since been overtaken by fungus and random plant life. I backed out of the room and pushed open the door on my left. I walked inside, and nothing appeared to be out of the ordinary. That was, until I saw something peeking out from behind the desk. It looked like a boot. Making my way around it, my pace slowly came to a stop. I think I had found the owner of the cabin. It was a man, or at least I think it was due to the clothing, because the skeleton still made it difficult to tell. The clothes seemed to have been torn up, most likely due to wild animals. I thought I wonder if the person had a heart attack or some sort of accident. I then thought about how terrible it must have been to have died up here all alone. Just then, I heard a noise that sounded like the front door swinging shut. I felt my body freeze in place. I waited and listened for a minute or two. After not hearing anything, I thought it must have just been the wind blowing the door shut. I started to hear the floor creak. Somebody was in the cabin with me. I quietly backed up behind where the sturdy door opened up and pressed my back flat against it. A voice, like a ragged whisper, drifted down the hall. Hello. It sounded like an old man. I'm not sure why, but I stayed quiet and waited. Another voice, but this time it was loud. Who's out there? When I heard them say this, it sounded strange. It didn't seem like the correct way to ask if someone was inside the cabin. Just as I had this thought, the door on my left began to move slightly. It opened up, but I was still behind it, so the door just gently rested against me. I could still see around the frame, however, and whatever had opened the door was crawling on the ground. My eyes grew wide with each passing second. Its gray skin and disformed figure were unlike anything I had seen before. Long fingers with sharp nails quietly pressed into the wood in front of it. Disjointed feet pushed the rest of the body along. I remember thinking it sort of looked like that creature from The Lord of the Rings, or maybe a hairless dog. It crawled around slowly before climbing up onto the desk in the room and looked down at the skeleton. Then, that same voice sounded. Who's out there? I realized at that moment that the voice was coming from this thing. Just then, my body weight shifted and the floor beneath my feet, and the wood creaked. This thing snapped its head to me, its face with two gray eyes and a mouth like a cavern of teeth below. Then, it reared back and unleashed a deafening shriek at me.
I quickly swung around the door, slamming it shut behind me. I dashed out of the cabin, nearly falling onto my face off the porch. My quick breathing was doing nothing to calm my panic state as I forced my way through the trees and over the rocks. I didn't know exactly where I was going. I just knew it was down the mountain. My lungs were starting to sting in my chest, but I kept my pace up as long as I could. After nearly an hour of running, my foot slipped on a slick rock, and I fell over through brush and trees. I could feel scrapes and scratches forming on my face, as well as bruises beginning to form on my body. I came to a rest in the mud and nearly fainted. My eyes shot open a moment later as I heard a rustling of bushes. I scrambled back up and continued moving down the mountain, now with more of a limp. After nearly 10 more minutes of limping down the mountain, I exited the trees, not too far from where I had parked my car. Seeing this gave me hope I had never felt before. As I approached, I began to feel my injuries more and more. I quickly got inside my car and safely drove home. I've been laying on this couch with ice packs ever since I got home. I gave my ex a phone call this morning, and I asked her if she still hiked up on that mountain. She told me that she did, and I told her exactly what I'm about to tell all of you right now. If you ever feel like going camping or hiking up a mountain alone, don't. There's something living up there in the mountains, in those woods, something terrifying, and it's something you don't ever want to see for yourself. I've been living in the Southwest for my entire life, and I'll be the first to tell you that there isn't much going on here, even though I assume that could be said for pretty much anywhere that isn't Disneyland. To be honest, there's only two guarantees living in the Southwest: the scorching heat and the rocks. I remember my mom taking me over to the Grand Canyon when I was little, and I couldn't help but think, this is it. I wasn't excited like your average kid, but my point was still valid. It was just rocky formations and the sun bearing down overhead. Once the initial feeling of viewing the canyon went away, I just couldn't wait to get back home. Growing up, I found comfort in my friendships. While the town and landscape offered little in the way of entertainment, the friends I had made over the years made up for it. We would spend our summers riding our bikes through the various side streets and circling all the blocks. We would just be outside convenience stores on hot days. The years slipped by so quick, and before I knew it, I was sitting in a lecture hall, listening to the professor just rattle on. The college life wasn't what I had imagined. Growing up, I had heard all these stories from adults about the good times they had in college. It seemed to be far more work than play. All of my professors were demanding, and my off hours were filled with whatever part-time job I could find at the time. Lucky for me, it wasn't all that bad. One of my closest friends, Drew, had gone to the same college with me. We had most classes together, so that made it a little bit more exciting. Drew was one of the first people I had met growing up. He had moved to the neighborhood roughly a year before we began school together. We became fast friends, which could be perceived as quite strange from the outside. Drew was extremely outgoing, the type of person to always be the center of attention. Meanwhile, let's just say that I was less approachable. Looking back, I guess it's quite humorous to think about. He was very popular in school, but instead of hanging out with the plastic clique, as I called them, he would choose to hang around with me. Eventually, our group of friends grew over the years. Alan, Mikey, Logan, Nate, and Riley. And with Drew and me added into the mix, that made 7 of us. However, by the time we all graduated high school, only 3 of us lived in town. Drew and I both got accepted into the same college just outside of town, while Nate had gotten a pretty steady job working at a warehouse. Even though that seemed to take up all his time, the others moved out of town or out of the state. The end of college was quickly approaching, and during lunch one day, Drew mentioned to me that he had a job lined up for him out of state. As much as it hurt to hear, I understood and was happy for him. That of course forced me to think about my plans after college, and I quickly realized I didn't have many aspirations. I think Drew could tell by my expression that the news was somewhat heavy for me, but he assured me that everything would be fine. I ended up just returning a shrug. Before we returned to our classes, he mentioned that he was working on something that would make me much happier. My curiosity lit up as I wondered what he could mean by working on something. As the days and weeks passed, I had completely forgotten about this conversation. Until about a week after graduation, Drew messaged me and asked if I was available for an upcoming weekend. I checked my calendar, and I told him I was, but of course I inquired as to what it was about. He said he wanted to go camping. We had never gone camping before, and Drew didn't really strike me as the outdoors type. He pleaded with me that this would be really fun, and despite having a couple of reservations about it, I agreed. I made note of the weekend and marked it on my calendar. I bought what I imagined to be enough provisions for a day or two, and waited for Drew to pick me up. He arrived late in the morning on Friday, and I hopped into his car. He flashed a grin that seemed to hint like he was hiding something. I asked him what was up, but he just shook his head. We drove out of the town for a few miles before turning off onto a dirt road. The road began to go up the side of a rock formation, and we arrived at the peak of this hill. I noticed this large, flat clearing. These small mesas are not uncommon, but I was surprised that this was going to be our destination. As we rode to a stop, I noticed a few other cars in the vicinity. I immediately recognized the people standing next to them: Alan, Mikey, Riley, Logan, and Nate. Two of them were busy setting up tents while another was busy getting the fire started. I chuckled and shook my head. Drew briefly patted me on the shoulder before we both hopped out. Everyone was in great spirits, and we spent most of the day remembering about the past. We got the campsite all set up, and I began soaking everything in around the edges of the hilltop. My feelings towards this rocky terrain was much different than when I was younger. As I stood there attempting to soak in my surroundings, I noticed something off in the distance. A large dark shape was moving slowly down the hill. I tried to focus my eyes by squinting, but it wasn't helping. Nate then patted me on the shoulder and asked me if I wanted a beer. Showing the still semi-full can in my hand towards him, he nodded and began to walk away when I called him back over. I asked him to check out this weird shape on the other hill, and he stood there briefly scanning the terrain. He told me he couldn't see anything, and I began looking in the same area that I had last spotted it. Sure enough, the shape I had seen was gone. I shrugged, telling him it was most likely a wild animal or something. He gave me a weird look. I knew he was implying that I was drunk, but then he laughed and walked off. As I stood there, I couldn't stop thinking about that weird shape. In contrast to the terrain around it, it was quite large, and it seemed to crawl along the rocks. I had never seen an animal move like that before, so my brain was hyper-focused on whatever it was. I eventually pulled myself away from the cliff's edge and returned to the camp. We ate various foods we had brought along with us, and put a sizable dent into the alcoholic drinks we had brought. It wasn't long until we all retired to our tents for the night. At some point during the night, I was awoken to an odd sound. It sounded like someone was digging in the dirt outside of my tent. When I first heard this, my body initially seized up. There would be a long scrape in the dirt, followed by a stop, and then another long scrape. I thought maybe one of the guys couldn't sleep well and was just walking around outside, killing time, when I heard something new, something which sent a wave of uneasiness coursing through my veins. Something was breathing next to my tent. It was inhaling sharply and allowed a very quiet laugh. The laughing is what creeped me out, only because it sounded very artificial, like it was almost mimicking a laugh. The scraping then resumed before fading off in the distance, and the sounds of nature once again filled the night air. I laid awake in my tent for a few hours before falling asleep. I then woke up to Drew patting me on the leg. I shot up in panic, nearly striking him in the process. He went backwards with his hands up, and I caught my breath and apologized to him. He then asked if I could come outside and take a look at something. I stepped out from my tent and saw everyone standing around looking at the ground. I turned and saw large scrapes in the dirt around my tent before they trailed off towards the cliff. I could feel that familiar panic rising in my chest when suddenly I heard that fake laughing again, which nearly caused me to jump out of my skin. I spun around and saw Nate with a wide smile on his face. Then, all at the same time, everyone around erupted in laughing. My fear quickly turned to madness, then subsided and was replaced with acceptance. Mikey then appeared from behind my tent with a towel in his hand as he wiped the tears away from his eyes. After the laughing died down, Nate apologized and said he couldn't help himself. I nodded to him and accepted the joke. Honestly, it was a pretty good one. We all got back to hanging out and enjoying the day. As we sat around in our chairs, talking, the conversation circled back to the prank, and Nate asked what I thought was on the other hill. I attempted to brush them off, but they insisted. I described to them the shape, and they all tried to take a guess on what it was. Some of the ideas thrown around were coyotes or jaguars, and Mikey suggested it was most likely just a really big snake, to which we all started laughing. Later in the evening, after we all had a bite to eat, we were just about to bed down for the night when a piercing scream drew our attention. We all turned and saw Riley running towards us from the edge of the cliff in a state of panic. He managed to say he saw something over the edge of the cliff. His wide eyes darted to each of us, looking for acceptance when everyone, including myself, busted out laughing. Half of the group turned to me chuckling, and I told Riley that it was a good attempt, but it wouldn't work a second time. He then walked over to me and grabbed me by the shirt collar. He shouted at me that he wasn't joking, and I threw my hands up, attempting to push him off, when he suddenly released me. I brushed my shirt down, asking him what his problem was. When I looked back up at him, I noticed that he was no longer looking at me, but instead was looking at something past me. Everyone else became silent as they all stared in my direction as well. Slowly, I turned and saw what everyone else was looking at. There was a face just on the edge of the campfire light. It looked almost like a porcelain doll. I couldn't make out the rest of its body. I took a step backward and looked out of the corner of my eye just to make sure everyone in our group was here and that this wasn't just another prank. Everyone was right beside me, and I noticed that Nate looked more shaken than the rest of us. I turned back and saw a single hand appear into the light as it got closer to us. The arm was thin, but was nearly the size of its body. Its hand was pressing deeply into the dirt, with these fingers that came to a fine point. The fingers didn't appear rigid. They almost reminded me of the Grinch's fingers, which for some reason made me shudder. Even worse, another hand appeared, and it looked as if it was pulling its body behind it. As more and more of it came into the light, I watched this long, almost insect-like body. I did take note of something right away. As I was watching this happen, I couldn't hear a single sound from this creature. No shuffling of dirt, no fake laughing sounds. It was silent. Then I felt something touch my shoulder. Trying desperately not to scream, I looked and it was Drew. He whispered in a shaky voice that he wanted to run to the cars. I was only able to return a slight nod. Drew and I were just about to make a run for it when Logan, someone who is always quiet, screamed and began sprinting away. The creature's head then snapped to face him, and still without a sound, it darted back into the darkness, and all we saw was a large, shadow blur, heading towards his direction. Logan's screams were cut off, and I watched the streak of red shoot out towards us from the darkness. Droplets of blood impacted the campfire. A second later, Logan came flying into the light and hit the ground hard. He was gripping his leg, which had these massive cuts carved into it. We all scrambled to pick him up, and we dashed towards our vehicles. We threw him in the back and drove down the hill back towards town, and we didn't stop until we were at the hospital. We quickly carried him inside as the nurses and doctors took over from there. Drew and I looked down at our blood-stained hands and walked over to sit with the others. Drew was the only one of us who could somehow speak clearly, and he told the doctor that Logan had slipped off the edge of where we were camping, and that we were able to pull him back up, but he messed up his leg on some sharp rocks in the process. We were in the waiting room for a few hours until the doctor arrived and told us that he was going to be fine. He said his leg looked much worse than it actually was, which we all exhaled a sigh of relief. Just before the doctor departed, he turned and asked us again to confirm that the cause of this were rocks, and we all shakily nodded our heads at him. We thought he was going to press further, but he just nodded to his clipboard, returned a faint smile, and made a passing remark about him being lucky it was just his leg and not his head. Logan was released from the hospital after 5 days, and we all showed up to see him off home. He barely said 2 words to us the entire time. After that, one by one, everyone else went back to living their life, not even wanting to talk about that night. And just as Drew was getting his things in order, I asked him if his company was hiring. He stopped and flashed a faint, creepy smile, which upon seeing my expression, quickly shifted into a look of concern before telling me yes, they are. Day 1. I hit a deer on my way to work. It's actually very common where I live. It's an area that's filled with woods, with trees lining the road that are just perfect for concealing a deer until the moment it leaps in front of your vehicle. Apparently, at least 2 are hit and killed each day. My cousin and grandparents have all done it, quite a few times actually. So I guess it was a matter of time before I did. I was already running a few minutes late, putting off leaving as much as I dared. I opened the garage and stared at the black tree silhouetted while I slipped on my shoes. It's spooky, waking up at 5 a.m. to a pitch black world. I reversed the car, turning as I backed up to make a turn in my driveway. I didn't even bother to look back, cause obviously there's nothing ever there. On top of that, I know my own driveway. Well, I thought I did. I cussed and braked. That was either the low stone wall in front of the garden or something else, most likely a deer. I pumped the brake lights and looked through the back window. Nothing. I was already a few minutes late and figured I would either come home to a deer in my driveway or some damage on the house, and I drove off. I came home to none of those things. On the plus side, the car was fine. Day 7. I saw a deer today on my afternoon jog. I work the early morning shift, but have the afternoons off, and I make a genuine effort to exercise daily, no matter how tired or drained I feel. I often see deer hanging out in people's yards or the woods, so it wasn't an unusual sight. What was strange was the injury on her back right leg. It looked broken, with dry blood coating her side. I felt a stab of pity, but the way she was watching me made me more uneasy. She didn't flinch, stood like stone and stared. Despite the heat of my run, my skin was cold. At the end of the block, I glanced back to put my stomach at ease, and I saw nothing. Just a neighbor standing over the garden bed, staring back at me. Day 12. I've been seeing deer on every run I take. Every morning on my long drive through the middle of nowhere to get to work, my brights catch them on the side of the road. I think that's normal. They don't have any natural predators, unless you count cars. I haven't seen my bloody friend since last week, and I'm assuming she's most likely dead. These deer, though, the way they watch me makes my skin crawl. I refuse to let it get to me. Fortunately, I can blast my music and run faster. Anyways, whenever I see deer and check again, the deer's gone. Most likely scared off by the appearance of a neighbor or two who's shown up. They would help, if anything happened. Day 13. Yeah, fuck what I wrote the other day. I know deer are night creatures, but that cannot explain what I saw this morning. I opened the garage. On the edge of light cast by my garage was a massive deer, standing and moving silently in my yard. I jumped for my car and sped the hell out of my driveway. They didn't run in front of me, but they just watched. My hands were slipping on the wheel throughout my drive, and my heart continued to pound at work, and it wasn't the caffeine. As a matter of fact, I have stopped running after work. Day 17. I'm so embarrassed right now. I'm in tears. Since yesterday morning, I've been staying inside the house as much as possible. I was looking out my front window this evening, considering how quickly I can get in my car and through the driveway, when I saw the massive deer again. Only this time, and I know what I saw, there were about 3 people standing with them. I called 911 and told them what I saw out front. 3 police cars, apparently having nothing better to do, showed up, but the people and deer were gone within seconds of me calling. Typical. I spent over an hour with the police. I made it seem like this was the first time I had seen deer act like this. No, I didn't recognize anyone. And no, I didn't want to talk with anyone. I saw the people trespassing and freaked out. The police finally seemed to buy that, and they backed off. Day 19. I'm not sure what's gonna happen next, but please, I beg you, if you ever hit a deer on the road, or come across a deer that has been hit on the road, get out the vehicle and help it, because who knows, one of its friends might be watching you. And if you have hit a deer before, just look out your window tonight, and don't be shocked if you see somebody or something staring back at you. I was supposed to leave for work 30 minutes ago. It's pitch black outside, but I can just make out their inky forms in the woods, circling the light coming from my window. They're moving closer and closer. No one will believe me. I can't prove anything. All that I do know is there's one woman staring directly at my window who's come closer than the others have dared. A woman with a limp and dirty, matted jeans. I went to high school in Arizona, and we had lots of Navajo students. One of them who told me about her grandma. She said that when her grandma was young, her family thought there was a skinwalker stalking their home. I'm not sure what caused them to be suspicious, but they were examining all of the animals. They said that even though a skinwalker can assume any animal form, their eyes still stay human looking. And what's more, because they have human ears underneath the animal skin, they can't move their ears. So this girl's grandma was going around and tapping all the ears of the goats to make sure they could twitch them. She came to one goat and gave the ears a flap, and they just stayed limp. She then said that she looked right into the eyes of the goat, and 2 human eyes were looking back at her. She said that's when the skinwalker charged into her and knocked her over before running off. She said they never saw it again. After that, I have never looked at goats the same way again, or any kind of livestock in general. As a matter of fact, you should probably look into the eyes of any pets that you own, or any livestock, before going to sleep tonight. One of them might just be a skinwalker. A woman living in White River, Arizona, comes home late at night from running an errand. She pulls up her driveway, gets out of the vehicle, and using her keychain, opens the garage door. Just as it's going up, she hears something run up at her back. As she turns, she sees this dark, shadowy figure slip in behind her husband's truck, which is in the driveway, and to her left. The only thing that she sees is that it has patches of short, scraggly hair. And the feet that she saw don't look like they belong to anything that's human. She runs into the garage and into the house, screaming for her husband. He comes out the house and checks all around, but he finds nothing. He does tease her a bit and tells her that she shouldn't let her imagination get the better of her. However, only minutes later, a friend who the husband is expecting arrives. He's all excited and somewhat upset. He explains that as he was coming towards the house, some two-legged creature, he says it looked like a skinny bear, only really scraggly and skinny, with its mouth and teeth exposed, almost like it was drunk. It came stumbling out of the trees and straight into the side of his SUV. He slammed on his brakes, but when he got out to look, there was nothing on the road or off to the shoulder. The two then go out to have a look at the SUV, and sure enough, there's a small dent and some black hair stuck to the rear fender on the driver's side, and some hair in the bumper, but there's no blood. My older sister, who is Irish, Italian, recently got married. Not her first, to this guy who is Navajo. Shortly after they settled down together, she has a boy from her first marriage. They invite me to hang out with them down on the reservation, where her new husband has a house and some property. I ended up bringing a few friends. Being a white guy, I know nothing about native or skinwalker lore. One of the friends that comes along, Gregory, however, is into horror and demons, things like that, and knows all these different werewolf, vampire, and even skinwalker stories. That first night, with not much else to do, we are out in the middle of a few 100,000 acres of hills and wooded land. We end up sitting around a small bonfire, with him telling us one story after the next. The next day, we all take a walk to the elementary school to bring my nephew home. My sister usually picks him up, but she has some errands to run. Along the way, we pass this scraggly looking dude sitting beneath this tree beside the road. He looks kind of old, but in a way that is difficult to say just how old. Regardless, it's definitely creepy the way he's watching us. His eyes kind of flat and dull, as if unaffected by the sunlight. As we make our way back from the school, my nephew seems pretty quiet and shy. When he sees this guy, he ducks behind me and starts tugging on my shirt. I ask him what's up, and without taking his eyes off the guy, he whispers, "I don't like that man. He's bad." The way he said it gives me chills, but I really don't think all that much more about it. Well, that night, Gregory, and my other two friends, Jeff and Sarah, and I all head out to go check out this abandoned part of the reservation, which supposedly is haunted. We had been warned not to by my brother-in-law. He says it is an inhabited place of ghosts of the past and some kind of dark being. Of course, that only serves to make us want to go even more. So we dismiss his warnings and ghost stories, take the keys to my sister's SUV, and off we go. When we first get there, I have to admit, it is a lot spookier looking and feeling than any one of us had expected, consisting of only a handful of abandoned structures, most of the faded and graying wood, and the biggest of which is only 2 stories. It looks to me to have been some sort of mining town, like the kind that you see on westerns on TV. Anyways, just about every window is completely busted out, with only a shared appointed pane hanging here and there. There isn't a single door still in place, and definitely not an item of any value anywhere to be seen. In fact, there isn't much of anything at all. As we walk around, going up to and looking into some of the places, but not entering, Jeff takes us to telling us how this reminds him of one of his past flings with some girl. Sarah and I roll our eyes, as we always do when he starts waxing old memories and then goes off a little ways, leaving him and Gregory together. We find a cozy corner out of sight and start getting comfortable, if you know what I mean. We are going at it for all 5 seconds when we both notice it has suddenly turned chill. Just as we huddle together for warmness, we hear a blood-curdling scream. We jump up and run back into the direction of the SUV and where we last saw Gregory and Jeff. There, they are facing the remains of the storefront, their eyes staring straight ahead and oblivious to the fact that we are there. Sarah and I both look to where they are staring, and we see this creature, that it is a wolf-like creature, but yet not being a wolf completely. I'm still not sure to this day if it was real or not. Either way, I for one am scared, as I have never been in my life. Its body is fully covered in hair, and it had these long wraith-like fingers, which end in thick curled nails, definitely claw-like. Its head is the worst though. Its eyes are just these 2 chunks of dark coal, flat, and emotionless. Its mouth is full of small daggers. I'm not sure how long we stand there frozen. Finally, it takes a step forward, and as if released from some spell, we bolt to the truck. Jeff and I jump into the front seat, he to the driver's side, and me in the passenger, while Gregory and Sarah go for the back. Jeff doesn't have his license, but at that point no one's arguing. The keys are in the ignition. He starts the SUV, floors the gas, and we speed off gravel and sand flying everywhere. I look out the window on my side, and then all around. I see nothing through the cloud of dust and the darkening twilight. When I turn to look back at Gregory, the only thing he could think to say is, "You got some lipstick on your chin." Just down the road some, Jeff slows the truck. By this time we are all laughing and making fun of each other for running away from shadows. Just then, a look of fright comes over Sarah's face, and without saying a word, she points a trembling finger out towards the trees along the side of the road. There, back in the dark of the trees, is where we see the shadow-like figure running just inside the tree line, as if it's keeping pace with us, and we all yell in unison to Jeff, and he again presses down on the gas. The SUV springs into life, but that thing, whatever it is, stays with us every inch of the way. It is only when we see the lights to my sister's porch that making the turn off to her. When we pull up to the house, my brother-in-law is out on the porch with this guy dressed in a long-sleeve button white shirt, blue jeans, and work boots. He later introduces himself as the local shaman. When we get up to the porch, the guy is in the middle of some kind of blessing. When he finishes, my brother-in-law simply turns to us and says, "Now you know, maybe next time you'll listen." Later, after the shaman leaves, he admonishes us, saying that by telling the skinwalker stories, we put everyone out there in danger. He said just mentioning them can make them come and seek you out. For years, I was the guy you would call if you had a squirrel in your attic. I mean, to a lot of people, I'm still that guy. But over the last 20 years, I have branched out to other less common infestations. Now, I'm the guy you call if there is a haunted doll going through your attic, or a Sasquatch trampling your flower beds. I actually love my job. All the skills I have acquired have allowed me to travel across the country. I have met incredible people, and I have experienced cryptids like few have ever done before. It doesn't hurt that the pay is great, but the stories are even better. I have one short story for you now. It's more of a public service announcement than anything else, really. I have dealt with every sort of infestation from Sasquatches. You spray human urine around the area of sighting, and it will avoid the area. A demonic presence. You need to bring in a priest. Sometimes it can be tricked into inhabiting a lesser creature, like a frog. And jackalopes. It's just a bunny with some antlers. Put it in a cage and give the poor thing a carrot. But recently, there has been one cryptid that has been growing more and more invasive into human settlements. It's called the hide-behind. Most commonly found in the forests of the North United States and Canada. The hide-behind is one cryptid that cannot easily be dealt with. In fact, I'm not sure it's even possible for one of these to be bagged and tagged like we normally would with other creatures. To my knowledge, no hide-behind has ever been killed, maimed, dazed, or even simply removed from a residence. Once it has made a claim to an area, whether it be a local forest, a cave, or even, in one specific bloody case, a Bass Pro Shop, it will actually defend that area to the death. It was first documented by the Native Americans, then by the lumberjacks in the PNW of America. The hide-behind is one of the lesser known but cryptids on the continent, but without a doubt, one of the most dangerous. No one really knows what they actually look like. As the name suggests, as soon as they are seen, they quickly duck out of view to hide behind anything in the vicinity. Out in the wild, this would be trees and rocks. In your home, this could be a corner, a kitchen cabinet, a TV, or literally anything else they can manipulate their body to hide behind, an object of any size. In the few accounts of the sightings we have on record, they have been described as everything from a large bear, lion hybrid, to a frail and elderly woman with long arms and rashes on her skin. Because of this wide discrepancy in their descriptions, they are believed to be shapeshifters that can change their shape based on what they believe will best get their potential victim to come closer and investigate the sighting. I don't know why the hide-behinds are moving into suburbs. I guess destruction of their natural habitat, but it is becoming a real problem. That's why I'm going to share this story with you now, so you know what to do if one ever shows up in your home. I pulled up to Tim's house around 12 p.m. on a Tuesday. He had called in to tell us there was a demonic entity in his house. He wanted us to remove it ASAP. They always demand ASAP. Tim had nothing going on, but people are just so much more demanding now than they were 20 years ago. I took a quick look around the house, and it was pretty apparent there wasn't any sort of demon in his residence. Not only was there no reaction to the holy water and Ouija board I had brought with me, but Tim also didn't have normal symptoms of a demon haunting him. Bad dreams, sleep paralysis, or the witnessing of any telekinetic events. After further questioning, he described what he had seen in more detail. He said, "First, I was sitting right there on the couch watching TV when I got the feeling I was being watched. I turned my attention to the screen door, and for just a second, I saw a bear looking in through the screen. But it wasn't a bear, you see. A bear would have just kept on staring at me or keep poking at the door. But this thing just ducked out of view as quick as can be, like it was trying to sneak up on me, and I had caught it in the act. But I just grabbed my gun, set it on my lap, and kept on watching the TV, and eventually that feeling, like I was being watched, just kinda melted off. It was all peaches and cream until she showed up a few days later. This she that Tim was referring to was a new human form that the hide behind was taking. I assume it was because of the lack of a reaction to the bear form it had previously shown itself as. Like I said earlier, the hide behind wants you to look for it, to come near. Like the anglerfish, it dangles something in front of you, attempting to bring you closer. It's a lazy hunter. Tim then continued, "I was out in the garage in my workshop, and that feeling came over me again. That being watched feeling. I turn around, and I'm looking out the garage door, but I don't see anything. But then out of nowhere, I see a lady's head and shoulder pop out from the corner of the garage, and the second that she sees me looking at her, she pops right back around the corner where she came from. Well, this time, I went looking around for her, so I had seen crazy people, and she looked crazy, and I didn't want her grabbing me, so I gave a wide berth around that corner, and there was no one there. I walked all around the house, and I didn't see anyone, not even footprints. Tell me that's not demonic." It wasn't demonic. It was a hide behind, and I told the man as such. I told him living out here on the edge of town made him an easy target for it. I told him that there really isn't any way to get rid of them or scare them off. I told him he could try to leave his house for a year at minimum, and maybe, with luck, it will leave on its own, but the best bet would be for him to burn the place down and never come back. He didn't like that answer. My family lived in this house for 3 generations. I'm not leaving, and I sure as hell ain't burning nothing down. I'll tell you what though, I'm gonna keep my shotgun on me, and when I get that feeling again, I'm gonna shoot it. It works for bears, and that's the meanest thing around these parts. I don't see why it wouldn't work for this, what you call it, hide behind. You can't argue with anyone over the age of 65. People get set in their ways. Their beliefs calcify. So instead, I was honest with him. I told him 2 things. The first thing I told him was that eventually, he'll get that feeling that he was being watched, and he'll get his gun, and he'll start looking around for the hide behind, only he wouldn't find it. That's what happens in all these cases, because at that point, it found the best hiding spot it can possibly get, the only place you won't be able to lay eyes on it, directly behind you. And at that point, it's too late for you. The second thing I told him was that I'll be back in 2 days, and more than likely, he'll be dead. And then, that's when I left. 2 days later, I pulled my van up to Tim's driveway to find the screen door open and blowing in the wind. I didn't even need to cross the threshold of his house to find him. He was everywhere. On the floor, the ceiling, the walls. The smell was unbelievable. I poured some gas on the front porch, and then I used a match to light it. The house was an inferno within 30 seconds. I got in my van and started to pull out of the driveway, and I took one last look at the house, and then beyond, out in the tree line where I saw, for just a split second, a young boy, before he quickly pulled back and disappeared behind a thin, little tree. I was hundreds of miles away by lunchtime. I say all of this to you if you ever think you might have a hide behind in your house or even in the area. Leave. Burn the place down if you can, so nobody can move into it. These things are like bears. If they know they can get food someplace, they are just gonna keep coming back. And if you get the feeling that you're being watched and you can't figure out why, call your loved ones, because it's standing directly behind you. If you're reading this, congratulations. I'm most likely dead, or maybe worse. My name is Daniel, and I own quite a bit of land up in the Appalachian Mountains, left to me by my great auntie. So far, in the years I lived here, paranormal and downright disturbing things have happened to me here. People told me to just leave or report it, like I never done that before. To them, I'm just a young guy that went crazy a little too early. It bothers me that normal people have no idea what goes on up here, all alone. You see, my first encounter with them, I didn't know how to deal with them. I didn't even know what they were called until recently. It's important, or at least it's important to me that some of the tricks I have learned throughout the 3 years I lived up here could be of use to somebody one day. My second, or maybe third time I was being stalked by a skinwalker, it felt like I was walking in circles. I had a camera with an SD card pretty deep in the woods, but when I tried to walk back to my cabin, I kept passing the camera. I was walking in circles. This went on for hours. The sun was setting soon, and I was quite thirsty at the time, I remember. I sat up against the tree my camera was mounted on, and actually started crying. It was watching me, I guess waiting for me to fall dead. I hit myself in desperation a few times, trying to think. I sat up and took a very deep breath, wiped the water from my eyes, and it dawned on me. It's gotta be messing with my equilibrium. I have to be off balance. There's no other way. But I could still walk. But my depth perception was slightly off. All I had to do was tilt my head as far as it would go into my shoulder and walk back to my cabin. My ear was pressed into my shoulder, but even with one ear, I could still hear how anxious the creature sounded, pacing in the woods, hoping I didn't get away. Once I made it inside my cabin, I didn't come out for a couple of days for safe measures. Another trick they know is mimicking animals. I found that they like coyotes. I actually used to hunt coyotes back home, but never up here in the mountains. I seen a couple of my deer cameras that it looked like right after I left my camera, a coyote would follow me a while, if not all the way home. I had to stop that real quick and set out some snares. All the snare would and could do is jam the coyote's legs into the mechanism until a button is pressed, and then it could be unlocked. I set out a couple of them, but also rubbed some white ash on all the traps, and sure enough, the next time I started walking back from my camera, I hear the sound of one go off. I quickly ran back to where I had laid the traps, with a gun drawn, and all that was left was the trap in 3 separate pieces, and the scent of burning hair in the air. Every time I checked the camera after that, a coyote with a nasty burn scar on its leg would stop where the camera was mounted and turn around and walk back into the brush. And lastly, do not engage in any type of combat with them. Warding them off is one thing, but actually hunting them is a mistake. I wish I would have known that sooner. I had 2 buddies back in town I used to tell my stories to. Alcohol loosens the lips. Their names were James and Cole. I'm pretty sure they were cousins, but I never asked. Thinking about it now, I wish I would have gotten to know them better. But long story short, they're dead. And now, I'm dying. This morning, they came and pounded in my door insisting we hunt these skinwalkers. I told them it was a very bad idea, but they even took the liberty of buying silver bullets. They told me how much they cost, but I can't remember right now. I finally caved and we got ready all day. We first started making a large amount of white ash, cleaning our guns. Heck, they even packed MREs and special high-dollar spotlights. We set off right as the sun went down. We weren't 3 hours in when disaster struck. We were all sitting around a tree. I could tell that the skinwalkers were watching us. They're all around us, multiple. I'm scanning everything with my spotlight, not even realizing that Cole wasn't with us anymore. I asked James where he was, but he didn't seem nervous at all, and told me he may have had to go pee. I turned back to face my front, and there I see Cole. He's a good distance out, but something wasn't right. He was contorting in ways a human could never. I started to turn around to ask James what we should do, but halfway around, I heard James, guttural, sounding, breathing, like his lungs were filling with blood. I couldn't stand to be there anymore, and booked it back to the cabin. The forest seemed like it was laughing at me. In my desperation to run home, I knocked my flashlight running, and it was slowly getting dimmer and dimmer. I eventually had to ditch it and use some of the flares that Cole and James brought. I pulled the top off and struck it against a tree, and the red flame lit up the surrounding forest. There were so many of them, 10, 20, maybe more. But as luck would have it, they never attacked me. I could see the cabin and flung the door open and shut it behind me. I ran for the upstairs bedroom and quickly got into the old wooden closet where I'm currently typing this. I don't hear them, but they're outside my house. Unfortunately, in the midst of running away, I did end up getting clawed, or maybe bit. It's not a terrible wound, but it's bleeding black. If you're reading this, if you can, please send help. I really do need it this time. This story comes from Gallup, New Mexico. Family members are inside their home and getting ready for bed. All of a sudden, the dogs outside start raising a ruckus. The man of the family, including an uncle and some nephews, go outside to investigate, concerned about coyotes getting into the hen house. They think they see something moving about within the trees to the back of the house. The uncle picks up a handful of rocks and throws one after another into the trees. However, they hear or see nothing further outside of the ordinary, and so they end up returning to the house. With everything normal, the night is quiet and the dogs have stopped barking. They decide it's safe to go into bed. Just then, they hear a loud rustle from the trees, from the limbs whipping and branches snapping. They rush back out to the yard. All is quiet again. For 30 minutes or so, they stand guard, but not even the wind is blowing. The next morning, they go back outside and see that the gate to the hen house, as well as the door, is wide open. All of the birds are gone. The men end up searching the yard, and out by the outhouse, they discover, instead, an odd set of tracks going back and forth, as if something upon 2 feet was pacing between there and the trees. Finding no signs of the chickens, they return to the area around the hen house to look for similar tracks, knowing that only one person or someone similar could have opened the gate and the door. But the only marks they find are within the pen, and they all belong to chickens. The grandmother, who is standing at the back door of the house, tells them that it was a skinwalker. She says a prayer, and together they yell in a loud voice and in Navajo, "Go away, go bother someone else." It all started when summer came, and me and my 3 friends, Leah, Kathy, and Jennifer, were all planning to go camping. Leah asked her dad if he could drop us off, and he agreed. When the next day came, we started heading up. Leah's dad had set up the camper that we were using. He told us there were some spare blankets inside, in case we got cold. Leah's dad finally got into his truck and turned around. He stopped and rolled down his window and said, "No boys," to all of us. He then gave us a smile to let us know he was joking with us, and drove off. There was 3 rooms, 1 master bedroom, and 2 rooms with bunks. Each room had a TV in it, so nobody cared what room they got. Everyone knew that Jennifer didn't like small rooms, so we ended up letting her have the big room. I was in the room with Leah, and Kathy was in a room by herself. I started unpacking when we heard a loud noise outside. "Leah, did you hear that?" "Hear what? That noise?" We both looked at each other, startled, and then continued unpacking. But something seemed off. It was the fact that Leah was so chill about it. I was done unpacking, so I walked outside and started a fire. Jennifer walked out, and then she asked if I saw it. I responded with, "Saw what?" That's when she started freaking me out. She then started staring at me, but behind me, panicking. Her eyes darted back and forth, and then she was calm. I felt as if something was watching me, so I turned around, and I saw an orb in the corner of my eye, reddish, black, but by the time I turned around to fully look, it was gone. I was so freaked out, because we were in the middle of nowhere, you can say, and it was only the 3 of us, by ourselves. I then told Kathy that she could cook instead. We had her family's secret recipe of shepherd's pie, and a bunch of vanilla cupcakes. There were about a dozen cupcakes left in the open box, so we just left it on the table and went to bed. I could hear the TV coming from Kathy's room, so I punched the wall and told her to be quiet. Right after I said it, everything went quiet. But then, there was a small scream in the distance. It didn't sound human. It gave me chills that ran down my spine. But I ended up dozing off. But then, I woke up in the middle of the night, hearing noises, like if someone was in the kitchen. I wake up Leah, and then we walk out into the small hallway that led into the kitchen. We saw Jennifer sitting on the table, just staring straight ahead, with Kathy being right behind me. We were looking at her, and Jennifer was making weird noises, weird sounds. She was really creeping us out. She never did this or stared into space this often. But then I noticed something in the corner of my eye. It was a shadow. It was staring at Jennifer, and then it slowly turned to face me and Kathy. I froze. Kathy froze. Then Jennifer looked at us as if she was being mind controlled. And then this figure or shadow ran out the window, and Jennifer dropped her head into the table. We were trying to wake her up afterwards, but she wouldn't wake up. This experience still scares me to this day, and it is only one of the creepiest things I have ever seen. Me and the others are still very close friends. We even live together now. But we all remember that night and whatever it was that we saw. It turns out that Jennifer remembers seeing it in the daytime, but she says she doesn't remember anything when nighttime came and when we saw it. It freaks us out even more now, knowing that our friend wasn't even awake and staring into space with her eyes wide open. So I want to first say that I don't know much about skinwalkers and other creatures of similar nature. I just now started learning of their potential existence. So now I'm willing to learn and be educated even more on these topics, especially ever since I came across something at night. There's this park my girlfriend and we used to go to smoke there a lot, and we encountered this same dog-like thing multiple times, and it was always at night. It looked like a really huge black dog with round bear-like ears and yellowish eyes. The first few times we saw it, we didn't think much of it, but then we noticed that it kept just like spawning in. It never made a sound, and it always just stared at us, and it would follow us around the park in a creepy way. And just an FYI, we encountered this dog while we were high and while sober on many different occasions. Anyways, we ended up not going to that park no more. But before we stopped going, one of the creepiest things that's ever happened to me happened at that park. We were walking from the parking lot to the park, and we would just see this thing emerge from behind a tree and follow us and try to block our path back to the car. Sometimes we had to run and jump a fence just to get away from it. We never had a single dangerous interaction outside of this one time we were at the deepest corner of the park that was bordering a small forest, and we had to jump about 2 fences to avoid that thing. I do have a theory. It could be a stray, but it really did not act like a dog at all. It didn't even feel alive. I felt like it was just actually watching us for some reason, but it was really eerie. My mother is visiting my brother's family just east of Nevada. My brother and his wife have a night out, and mom's watching over the kids, who are 3 and 5 years old at the time. She has just gotten them off to bed and goes into the living room to watch her programs. She nods off in front of the TV and is awakened around 11:30. She says that she hears whistling, not the bored, absent-minded kind, but by someone who is really good at it. She finds it strange that someone would be outside at this time of night, not only whistling, but seemingly close to the house. She goes over to the picture window. The moon is bright, the reflection casting a pale glow upon the rooftops of the nearby houses that are on the reservation. When suddenly, dogs from the neighbors all start barking at once. They sound scared, and they are barking like if it's a warning. Despite the noise, she now hears a different whistle, the kind of police use or sports officials, and it's coming from there, by the road, which runs along the side of the house. She puts on her robe and goes out to the porch and around to that side of the house. There in the road is this guy, who when he notices her standing there, says that he's the local medicine man. He holds up his whistle like it's some kind of badge. He then tells her there is a skinwalker running through the neighborhood and that she should go back inside and lock the door. My brother finds out the next day from the neighbors that there was a critter of some sort jumping from one roof to the next. So anybody listening to this, if you ever hear whistling out at night, don't go outside. If you hear any noises outside your window at night, don't go outside. And whatever you do, don't ever say a word or whistle back. I'll tell you something that is true and real. My grandpa lived in Utah. He always told me stories about skinwalkers and how they could take the form of any animal or anyone that you know. I asked him one day if he had ever met one. He told me that he did, a long time ago when he was, and he said, young and foolish. It was long before I was born, or even my mother. He explained that he had gone to the valley. He called it Skinwalker Valley. He said it was a valley where nothing living ever ventures out, and where even crows, the guardians of death itself, won't go. It's a place of darkness and evil. He told me he went out there one day because he wanted to show others there was nothing to fear. Nothing but city superstition. He said he went out there in his old pickup truck, red in color but faded. When he found the valley, he saw that the grass on the ground and all of the trees were black. He said that the trees were still living though, and not far from where he exited his truck, he said there was a house. It was very old. The roof had fallen in, and the door was gone. When he got closer to it, he said he noticed what looked to be deep scratches or claw marks on the side walls. He also described seeing the scattered bones and partial skeletons of animals all over the place, as if he had wandered into some sacred burial ground. As he is standing outside the house, he dares not to go in. He hears the voice of his grandmother, but she had died some time prior. Then there were other voices. They were calling to him, calling for his life, his skin, his blood, and even for his spirit and soul. He knew them to be the voices of the lost, those who could change from man to beast. He quickly ran back to his truck, convinced that he was being pursued every step of the way. Right after that, and for some time to come, he would find possessions of his, even if they were brand new and unused, broken, torn, missing, or even, as was the case with some of the family's animals, dead. It even got to the point where he wouldn't let his dog stay outside at night. And to show me that he wasn't lying, and he made me promise I wouldn't tell my mother, he pulled up his shirt and showed me these deep and ugly scars along his back. He told me that they were made by the claws of the skinwalker that chased him back to his truck. His only warning to me was to never look a skinwalker in the eye. If you do, it will never forget you and mark you for life. It will have your soul. My grandfather passed away recently. At his ceremony, my uncle laughed in a way that was kind of uncomfortable. Joked that he always thought my grandpa was a skinwalker himself. I'm having a hard time remembering the stories told to me by my Navajo family, but when I Skype with them again, I will ask. This creepy set of events happened directly to me. So here goes. My first personal encounter. It's lengthy, but hey, skinwalkers. They require a backstory. It started when my two brothers, David and Luke's girlfriend, Sarah, all drove down to the desert to spend some time in the country. This is a reservation land, as it were, so there was red dirt everywhere. Southern Utah, a beautiful place if you ever get a chance. We had some pistols and decided to go out and do some target practice. We took our gear and some old targets to a place called Devil's Heartbeat. I had never been there, but all three of them were familiar with the area. It was a canyon about 200 feet deep. We stayed on one end of the canyon. About 50 feet over, the opposite side of the canyon rose up above us, Anasazi ruins. The Navajo may disagree with historians on the Anasazi's origins and departure. According to Navajo legend, they simply disappeared from existence, leaving behind plates, dishes, and food, and went into another dimension, or some equivalent. But whatever the history, the Navajo do not like to wander in Anasazi ruins. I have never asked why, but I figured it has something to do with disrespect, preserving history, etc. As such, none of the others cared a bit about these canyon ruins. They were more interested in shooting pistols. I could see old beds and even cave drawings on the cliffs with my naked eye, and I got this strange fixation on going over there. I'm not Navajo, and I felt that their rules didn't apply to me. I set off down the cliff without rope and decided I would climb down, cross the canyon floor, and then climb back up. This was a bad idea for a million reasons, but it was somewhat of a obsession. I can't explain the feeling. It was like magnetism. I wanted to be in those ruins, and it wasn't just some tourist-like curiosity. It felt like I was meant to go there. I kept slipping and getting stuck on the rocks, and I was so frustrated I almost started crying. Finally, I was deterred by the unmistakable sound of a growl coming from the canyon floor below me. There were trees down there, so I couldn't see what was making that noise. A mountain lion immediately rose to mine, and I got my ass back up to the cliffside. I said nothing to the others, and we shot the guns for a while. The only other strange occurrence was while Sarah was aiming, things got really quiet. We all heard a sound from behind us, maybe 20 feet away. It was almost like a growl, then a hoarse laugh, almost like a lion, and then a hyena. We had a clear view of the entire area, and there was nothing there. At least, not on the cliff tops, where we heard it anyway. The creepy part was that while David, Sarah, and I all heard it from a close distance, Luke heard the exact same noise right by his ear. We ended up camping out there to see if anything would happen, and this is when I got completely terrified. Before, I was only scared of wild animals. Even though we had guns, we were sleeping with no bags or tents. All we had were some blankets under the stars and a little fire, so I felt safe when we all lay down. I fell asleep pretty quickly, but woke up a few hours later to see everyone else laying down with their eyes open wide, listening. The canyon was completely full of noises. The only way to describe it is people banging rocks together. There would be one set, maybe 300 yards away, then another clacking 200 yards away, and then 50 yards away. The canyon echoes, so it was hard to tell exactly how many rock smacking rock noises there was, but they sounded like Morse code. We listened to this for maybe 10 minutes. No other animal noises. Nothing. Finally, David, who is kind of a hard ass and the least superstitious of his family, shouted, "Shut up!" And everything, I mean everything, immediately stopped. My heart was in my throat. We just sat there and stared at each other, wide-eyed. It was dead quiet. And then another super weird noise from the Anasazi ruins. I don't know how to explain this one either, but it sounded kind of like a zebra noise, like these squeaky thrills. It got louder, and then the rocks, sticks, whatever started up again. But this was worse, because now other animal noises came. We heard what sounded like wolves or coyotes barking, monkeys screeching, owls hooting, and through it all, that terrible zebra noises. We said nope and got our happy little asses out of there immediately. It took us maybe 10 minutes to douse the fire, pack our blankets, and speed away, and the noises continued that entire time. That night, I was obviously pretty shaken up. Before I could fall asleep again, my Navajo mother came and sat by me, and she said that she could tell I had a rough day. We hadn't mentioned the creepy shit to avoid a lecture about fucking with the spirits. She asked me about it, and I ended up spilling my guts about not seeing the canyon ruins. It was something personal, it felt like. I wanted to go there. Why couldn't I go there? It would have been beautiful. After I told her all about it, I could see that she had a really concerned look on her face. "What is it?" I asked, totally confused, and she explained something I had no idea about. The spirits in the ruins like to draw people up. When they get up on the ground, the spirits push them off. That's why we don't go there. I remained creeped out for the remainder of the visit. Fast forward a few weeks later, I worked at a shitty call center in Salt Lake City, third shift. It was my first night being alone, and I was feeling jumpy. My brothers already warned me that I had a skinwalker following me, but I, of course, didn't believe it. I don't smoke, but I follow my coworkers out for smoke breaks because I like to chat. Tonight, I lurked in the doorway because I had this horrible cloud of dread hanging over me. I was peeping out the glass door and being a total weirdo. It hit me then how paranoid I had been, and that's when I remembered that's what skinwalkers do. They mess with your mind. While I was pacing in front of the glass door, I decided that this whole thing was fucking stupid, and I was gonna go outside and stand there for the rest of my 10-minute break. Most of the smokers were already filling back in, but I walked out and put my hands in my pockets, looked at the sky, looked in the building, mentally patting myself on the back for not being a pussy. Then I saw something that I will never, ever be able to give a rational or even halfway accountable explanation for. We have like 6 parking lots, and one of the lots far away from me, maybe around 100 feet, I could see something walking. It was a dog, obviously, but it was almost limping and walked like it was tired or hurt. Me being the animal lover, forgot all about skinwalkers, and I started walking towards it, making the "come here doggy" noises, and then I stopped. That's when I saw it. The dog had the body form of a greyhound, and it was gray, but there was something very wrong with it. It had bloody legs, and it was limping, but it walked more like a person would, on feet and hands. Its butt was moving to and from, if that makes any sense. When it heard me getting close, it just stopped without turning, something I had never known any dog to do. And finally, it looked over its shoulder at me, and this is the freaky part. This dog was looking at me the way a person does. It had huge eyes, way too big for a greyhound, and its teeth were barred like it was considering biting me. Then it growled, but it was like a whistle growl, noises no animal makes. It almost sounded like it wanted to talk, or like if it was taunting me. Somehow, in the middle of all this, I realized it didn't have a tail. And I knew and heard from all the Navajo stories that skinwalkers, when they appear as animals, don't have tails. Forgetting all logic and rationality, I turned and took off. I didn't look back until I was back inside the building and had pulled the door shut behind me. And by then, when I looked, of course, the fucking thing was gone. When I described this to my brothers, they were absolutely sure it was a skinwalker, and they went through the trouble of blessing me, my apartment, blessing them and their apartments. I never saw the creepy bloody dog again, and I have never, since even slightly, wanted to visit the cliff ruins. Just to give some background, this happened in the mountains, near El Cerro de Tomé. Okay, so Friday, 1:28 a.m., me and my friends decided to go for a drive. We sometimes like to go to the Llano mountains near El Cerro to experience something that only happens in that area, paranormal and supernatural. Like any other time we do this, we go in my car and drive past Dome Hill, going towards the mountains, and park across from VHS. Then we sit and take in the scenic beauty of the dark desert. We started by listening close to anything and looking everywhere, being hyper observant. At first, we saw a light in the distance, getting within about a mile away from us, then disappearing altogether. We then decided to move on from there because we had to, and I mean had to, see something else. We were driving through roads and flying by at least 30 miles per hour over the speed limit. We then turned down a familiar road. This is the road we knew that something was about to change me and everyone else. It was 4 of us in total. We looked to the right side of the car, saw what we all believed to be something like a hellhound or maybe a skinwalker, when this massive black dog just launched at my vehicle while I was going 45 through the road. We should have felt impact from this massive creature, but we didn't. We then stopped the vehicle, and both people in the back seat looked and saw this thing rise up from the ground. It rose up from the ground and stood straight up on 2 legs, absolutely huge. It was all black with red eyes that are forever imprinted in our minds. I then slammed on the gas, and we sped up to about 55. We took off so fast, and as I looked in my rear view mirror, I could see it. Huge fucking coyote, standing on 2 legs, looking at us as we're driving away. I had only 2 encounters with a skinwalker, both at our house in Window Rock, Arizona, By the way, we are Navajo. The first encounter was when I was playing around with the PlayStation. My sister and her boyfriend are on the couch. The front door is wide open. There's no screen door. It is nighttime, summer, and hot. I put the game down and feel compelled. I don't know why, but I just walk out onto the porch. At first, I don't notice anything out of the ordinary, but I do feel a bit anxious. As I turn to come back inside, out of the corner of my eye and to the far side of the yard, I see this figure, dark against dark, moving across the lawn. I then catch the smell of rotten meat. I call into the house for my sister and her boyfriend. They come outside as well, and the three of us watch as this critter gets up on 2 feet, strolls into the trees at the edge of the property, and paying us no mind. It then disappears into the dark. Moments later, and off in the distance, we hear this chanting. It's in Navajo, and it sounds as if it's coming from everywhere at once. And then, it just stops. My second encounter happened about 2 years after the first one. I'm outside in our backyard, in the same property, but it's later in the day, but not quite night. The sun is still out, but it's a bit orange in the sky, and just below the tops of the trees to the west. Way out at the end of the property, where we have these bushes, and just before the woods, I see this figure. It's crouched down and looking at me. Then it just stands, but it's not very tall, not even 5 feet. At first, I think it's a man, but from what I can tell, it's not wearing any clothes. And if it is naked, it isn't skin and bones, not like any person I have ever seen. But before I could call out or anything else, it turns and lopes off, very awkward, with its shoulders rolling from side to side and its arms hanging way too low. This story comes from Gallup, New Mexico. Family members are inside their home and getting ready for bed. All of a sudden, the dogs outside start raising a ruckus. The man of the family, including an uncle and some nephews, go outside to investigate, concerned about coyotes getting into the hen house. They think they see something moving about within the trees to the back of the house. The uncle picks up a handful of rocks and throws one after another into the trees. However, they hear or see nothing further outside of the ordinary, and so they end up returning to the house. With everything normal, the night is quiet and the dogs have stopped barking. They decide it's safe to go into bed. Just then, they hear a loud rustle from the trees, from the limbs whipping and branches snapping. They rush back out to the yard. All is quiet again. For 30 minutes or so, they stand guard, but not even the wind is blowing. The next morning they go back outside and see that the gate to the hen house, as well as the door, is wide open. All of the birds are gone. The man ends up searching the yard, and out by the outhouse, they discover, instead, an odd set of tracks going back and forth, as if something upon 2 feet was pacing between there and the trees. Finding no signs of the chickens, they return to the area around the hen house to look for similar tracks, knowing that only one person or someone similar could have opened the gate and the door. But the only marks they find are within the pen, and they all belong to chickens. The grandmother, who is standing at the back door of the house, tells them that it was a skinwalker. She says a prayer, and together they yell in a loud voice and in Navajo, "Go away, go bother someone else." This event happened just south of Polaca, Arizona, within the Navajo reservation. A pair of skinwalkers, they say an old couple that lived deep back in the reservation, were seen lurking around this small cattle ranch. 2 heifers had disappeared recently, one of which was discovered down by the creek and mutilated. The man who owned the ranch, his 2 sons, and his brother armed themselves and went out to try to run them off. One of the sons, not yet 18 years of age, was searching out beyond the barn when a dark shape, materializing from the darkness itself, loomed up in front of him, almost nose to nose. As the boy attempted to raise his rifle, the figure raised its hands up to its face as if it was going to yell something. The boy, trying not to look at it in the eyes, then felt something rush into his face, like dust or sand. Even though he tried not to, he ended up taking a breath, and some of it was inhaled in. Immediately, things went dark, and he started experiencing hallucinations. The others found him only minutes later, on his knees, holding the sides of his head, and his eyes rolled back. He fell to the ground and went into some sort of trance. His body limped, and he became unresponsive. They carried him back to the house, and they summoned the local medicine man, who came and said some prayers over him, but he told the others there was nothing to be done but to wait for the dust, traces of which were still on his face and his shirt, to wear off. He promised he would come back the next day when the sun was up and bless the Hogan. Later, after he had regained consciousness, the boy swore to the others that he was the victim of a dog-faced creature. He described it as not quite as tall as he is, thin and scraggly, with patches of mangy and dark hair, a canine snout only shorter than a dog's, and with the smell of rotten eggs or worse. He said he doesn't recall anything more before passing out, other than not being able to breathe and having no control over his own body.